let's settle in for a story tonight. It's not one of kings or grand battles, but of ordinary people facing an extraordinary darkness. It's a story about a time when the world itself seemed to be ending. A quiet terror that changed everything for those who survived it. We're going to travel back to the mid-14th century, to a world lit only by fire and stars. It was a time of faith, tradition, and a deep connection to the land. But a shadow was stretching across the known world, carried on ships and whispered about in markets. Imagine a global disaster, but one that moves at the speed of a horse-drawn cart. There were no news channels, no scientists, just rumors and a terrifying, invisible enemy. The Black Death wasn't just a historical event. It was a personal apocalypse for millions of people. So find a comfortable spot and dim the lights. Let the worries of your day fade away into the background. We are about to step into a world that no longer exists, to understand what it truly felt like. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in a place of life and energy, a busy port city on the coast of Italy. The year is 1347. The air smells of salt, fish, and wood smoke. The sounds of merchants haggling, children laughing, and seagulls calling fill the narrow cobblestone streets. Life here is predictable. You know your neighbors. You know the baker, the blacksmith, the priest. Your world is small, but it is whole. You believe in God, you fear your Lord, and you hope for a good harvest. Everything feels permanent, as if it will last forever. One autumn afternoon, a dozen trading ships appear on the horizon, their sails full. This is a common and welcome sight. Ships mean goods, news from afar, and money for the city. People gather at the docks, eager to see what treasures have arrived from the east. But as the ships draw closer, an unsettling quietness is noted. There are no sailors calling from the rigging. No one stands at the rails waving. The vessels drift into the harbor like ghost ships, moving with a strange and heavy silence that makes the crowd uneasy. When the dockworkers finally board the first ship, they find a scene of unimaginable horror. Most of the crew are dead, their bodies lying where they fell. The few who are still alive are barely conscious, trembling with fever and covered in strange, dark swellings. The city authorities act quickly, or so they think. They order the ships to be anchored away from the port. They refuse to let anyone else off. They believe they have contained the problem, that this strange sickness can be kept on the water. It's a tragic miscalculation. They did not understand the enemy. It was not just on the sick sailors. It was in the blood of the black rats scurrying down the mooring ropes and into the city's warehouses. It was on the fleas that jumped from the rats onto the dockworkers. For a few days, life in the city continues as normal. The incident at the harbor becomes a piece of frightening gossip, a story to be told over evening meals. People are concerned, but the threat still feels distant, something that happened to sailors from a faraway land. Then, the first dockworker falls ill. He develops a raging fever that makes him shiver uncontrollably. His wife tries to cool his head with damp cloths, but nothing helps. He becomes delirious, speaking of terrible things he saw on the ship, his words making no sense. Within a day, the telltale signs appear. Painful, egg-sized swellings in his armpits and groin. The town doctor is called. An old man who has only ever dealt with common fevers and broken bones. He has never seen anything like this. He is terrified. He prescribes the only remedies he knows, bleeding the patient to balance his humors and applying a warm poultice of herbs. The treatments are useless. The man's skin develops dark spots, earning the sickness its name, the Black Death. He dies in agony 2 days later. His death is a shock, but it is still seen as an isolated case. Perhaps he caught the sailor's sickness. His family is pitied. His body is given a proper Christian burial. The priest says the prayers and life for everyone else is expected to go on. But then the man's wife becomes sick. Her symptoms are the same. Then their oldest son. Then the neighbor who came to offer condolences. The sickness is not staying contained. It is moving from house to house, with terrifying speed, an invisible fire sweeping through the community. Panic begins its slow creep into the city's heart. People start to avoid the dockworkers' street. They cross to the other side when they see a member of his extended family. The gossip turns from pity to fear. Doors are barred. Windows are shuttered. The popular myth is that communities came together in the face of this tragedy. In some rare cases, they did. But the brutal truth is that terror shattered the bonds of society. The most fundamental human connections to family, friends, and neighbors were the first casualties. Healthy people did everything they could to avoid the sick. This was the most terrifying part. The sickness was so vile, so certain in its outcome, that love and duty were often overcome by the raw instinct for survival. It became a plague of profound loneliness. Imagine a mother refusing to see her sick child, leaving food outside their bedroom door but never entering. Or a husband abandoning his wife at the first sign of fever, fleeing the house and never looking back. These were not acts of monsters, but of terrified, ordinary people. The city's leaders and doctors were among the first to flee. They had the money and the means to escape to country estates, hoping to outrun the pestilence. Their departure left the common people without guidance, without medicine, and without hope. The social order collapsed. Priests, who were supposed to offer comfort and last rites, were faced with an impossible choice. Tending to the dying meant almost certain infection and death for themselves. Many bravely stayed and met their fate, but many others abandoned their churches, leaving the dead unblessed. With no one to enforce the law, the city became a place of desperation. People broke into the homes of the sick and the dead, stealing whatever they could find. They were not evil. They were simply starving as farmers stopped bringing food into the dying city. The very air seemed to become toxic. People held flowers or pouches of herbs to their noses, believing the sickness was carried on bad smells, the miasma. They burned fragrant woods like juniper and ash in their homes, hoping the smoke would purify the air and keep death away. Others turned to more extreme measures, born of superstition and utter desperation. They believed the plague was a punishment from God. Groups of flagellants appeared, men who would walk from town to town, whipping themselves in public as a show of penance, hoping to appease an angry God. These processions were grim spectacles. The men's backs would be raw and bleeding, their chants echoing through eerily empty streets. Ironically, their travels only helped to spread the disease further, carrying the pestilence from one desperate town to the next, a moving wave of death. Then there were the cures. People would drink potions made of ground-up emeralds or arsenic. Doctors would lance the painful swellings, a procedure that was excruciatingly painful and often caused the infection to spread even faster throughout the body. There was no logic, only fear. One of the most bizarre and useless remedies involved chickens. A doctor would strap a live chicken to the swellings of a sick person. The belief was that the chicken would draw the pestilence out of the body. Of course, it did nothing but terrify both the patient and the bird. As the death toll mounted, the basic rituals of life fell apart. There was no time for funerals. There weren't enough healthy people left to dig individual graves. The dead were left in their homes for days or simply dragged out onto the street. Cart collectors were hired for the grim task of gathering the bodies. Their haunting call, "Bring out your dead," would echo through the silent streets. Families would hand over their loved ones, parents, children, spouses, knowing they were destined for a mass grave, a final, anonymous resting place. These plague pits were dug just outside the city walls, huge, gaping trenches where hundreds, sometimes thousands of bodies were layered like lasagna, with thin coverings of dirt in between. The sheer scale of death was something the human mind was not equipped to handle. A writer from that time, Boccaccio, described a scene in Florence. He wrote that people died in the streets, in their homes, day and night. He said the city was so full of the dead that it had become a tomb for its own citizens. Let's pause on a single family. A merchant named Piero, his wife Elena, and their 2 small children. Before the plague, their home was full of noise and warmth. Elena would be baking bread, the children playing a game on the floor. It was a small, happy world. The plague took their youngest child first, a little girl of 5. She died in 2 days. Elena refused to leave her side, holding her, singing to her. A week later, Elena herself fell sick. Piero barred her in their bedroom, torn between love and a desperate need to protect his son. He would listen to her cries through the thick oak door, his heart breaking. After 2 days, the cries stopped. The silence was worse. He waited another day before he had the courage to open the door. He wrapped her body in a sheet and carried her out himself. Now it was just Piero and his son Marco. They lived in a silent house, in a silent city. They ate stale bread and tried not to look at each other too much, because in each other's eyes they saw their terror. They were survivors, but they were living in a graveyard. This story, in countless variations, was the reality for millions. The Black Death was not a distant statistic. It was an intimate, soul-crushing tragedy that happened in kitchens, bedrooms, and quiet city streets, tearing apart the fabric of life, one family at a time. And when people's prayers went unanswered and the church offered no protection, they looked for someone to blame. The fear was too great to be random. It had to be someone's fault. This search for a scapegoat led to one of the darkest chapters of this period. Suspicion fell upon outsiders. It fell on beggars, travelers, and lepers. But the most intense and violent hatred was directed at Jewish communities. A terrible and baseless rumor began to spread across Europe that the Jews were poisoning the wells to kill Christians. This conspiracy theory was, of course, completely false. Jewish people were dying from the plague at the same rate as Christians. The disease did not discriminate. But fear is not rational. People needed an enemy they could see and punish, and the Jewish community was an easy target. What followed were horrific massacres. In cities across Germany, France, and Spain, mobs attacked Jewish neighborhoods. They dragged families from their homes. They burned synagogues, often with people still inside. It was a wave of brutal, fear-driven violence. In the city of Strasbourg in 1349, the town council tried to protect its Jewish citizens, but the furious mob forced the council members from office. The new leaders arrested the entire Jewish population, hundreds of men, women, and children. They were given a choice: convert to Christianity or die. Most refused to renounce their faith. They were taken to the Jewish cemetery and burned alive on a massive wooden platform. It was a calculated, organized slaughter fueled by plague-induced hysteria. The Pope himself issued orders stating that Jews were not to blame, that they were suffering just like everyone else. But his words were powerless against the tide of popular rage. The violence continued, a brutal side effect of a world drowning in death and fear. And through it all, the plague continued its relentless march across the continent. It moved from Italy to France to Spain, and then it crossed the Channel into England in 1348. It arrived in a small port in the southwest, and the cycle began all over again. In England, the story was the same. Entire villages were wiped out, left to be reclaimed by nature. Farms were abandoned, crops rotted in the fields, and livestock wandered away and died. The carefully structured feudal system began to crumble under the strain. With so many dead, there was a massive labor shortage. The few peasants who survived suddenly found themselves in a position of power. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions from desperate lords who needed their fields harvested. It was a world turned upside down. This brings us to one of the most unexpected outcomes of the plague. For those who survived, the world after was completely different. The old certainties were gone. The rigid class structure had been shaken to its core. The psychological impact was immense. The art from this period reflects the trauma. It became obsessed with death. Skeletons were shown dancing with kings and peasants alike, a reminder that death comes for everyone. It was a dark, fatalistic view of a world that had seen the apocalypse and somehow barely survived. This new obsession with death in art and literature was more than just grim fascination. It was a form of collective therapy for a traumatized world. The Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, was a powerful symbol because it was democratic. In these images, a skeletal figure representing death leads people from all walks of life in a final, grim procession. A king in his crown, a pope in his robes, a wealthy merchant, a humble farmer, a young child, they all had to take death's hand. The message was brutally clear and, in a strange way, comforting. The plague was the great equalizer. It didn't care about your wealth, your power, or your piety. In the face of such an overwhelming force, all of humanity was rendered equal, stripped of earthly titles and possessions. This shared vulnerability was one of the few unifying truths in a world that had been completely torn apart by fear and suspicion. Let's consider the mindset of a survivor, a young farmer we'll call Thomas. Before the plague, his life was mapped out for him from birth. He would work the same plot of land as his father and his grandfather, owe service to the same lord, live and die within a 10-mile radius of his village. He accepted this as the natural order of the world, ordained by God. But after watching half his village, including his own parents and 2 older brothers, perish in a single season, that certainty was shattered. He was alive, but the world he knew was gone. The fields were overgrown, the cottages empty, the lord of the manor dead, with no immediate heir. The rigid structure that had defined his existence had simply dissolved, leaving behind a terrifying and yet strangely liberating emptiness. He was no longer just a link in an ancient chain. He was an individual, adrift in a new, uncertain reality. This newfound freedom was disorienting. At first, there was just grief and a hollow sense of disbelief. But as the weeks turned into months, a new feeling began to emerge. With so few people left to work the land, labor was suddenly valuable. For the first time in history, peasants like Thomas had leverage. A neighboring lord, desperate to have his fields harvested before the crops rotted, offered Thomas wages, actual silver coins, to work for him. This was revolutionary. Before, Thomas worked in exchange for a tiny strip of land to farm for his own family and the Lord's protection. Now, he was being offered money, choice, the ability to negotiate. He could say no. He could walk to the next valley, where another desperate lord might offer him even more. This shift in power, born from mass death, was the quiet beginning of the end of the feudal system. The psychological impact of this new reality was profound. Many survivors adopted a live-for-the-moment philosophy. After seeing how quickly life could be extinguished, long-term planning seemed pointless. What was the use in saving money or carefully tending a field for next year's harvest when the pestilence could return at any moment? This led to what the older, more conservative chroniclers described as a breakdown of morality. People spent their new wages lavishly on fine clothes they couldn't previously afford or on drinking in taverns. They feasted and celebrated, not out of joy, but out of a desperate need to feel alive, to seize what pleasure they could from a world that had shown them its utter indifference to their existence. It was a defiant, fatalistic celebration in the shadow of the world's largest graveyard. Imagine Thomas walking into a market town. Before the plague, he would have been an invisible man, another dirt-stained peasant in rough-spun wool. Now, he wears a tunic of dyed cloth, something previously reserved for merchants or minor officials. He inherited it, along with a small sum of money, from an uncle who died in the city. People look at him differently. The social lines that were once so sharp and clear have become blurred. A man's worth was no longer solely defined by his birth, but by the simple fact of his survival. This created immense tension. The old nobility, what was left of them, looked on with disgust at this new social mobility. They saw a world turned upside down, where common laborers were dressing and acting like their betters. They passed laws, called sumptuary laws, trying to regulate what people of different classes could wear, a desperate attempt to put the social genie back in the bottle. But it was too late. The world had changed forever. Thomas and millions like him had seen behind the curtain. They had seen that the lords and priests died just as easily as they did. The aura of divine right and untouchable authority had been washed away by the plague. This sowed the seeds of future rebellions and uprisings. When the ruling classes tried to force wages back down or reimpose the old, strict feudal obligations, the peasantry pushed back. They remembered their newfound power and worth. The peasants' revolt in England in 1381, decades after the first wave, had its roots in the social chaos and the new consciousness created by the Black Death. The survivors were not as willing to bow and accept their lot. They had faced the end of the world and walked away, and they were not easily intimidated anymore. The plague also changed the very landscape of the country. Entire villages were simply abandoned. Places that had been inhabited for centuries became ghost towns, the cottages slowly collapsing and the fields returning to wilderness. Archaeologists today can still find the faint outlines of these lost communities. For a survivor like Thomas, this was a visible scar on the world. He might walk a familiar path to a neighboring village to trade, only to find it utterly silent, the doors of the cottages swinging in the wind, the churchyard overflowing with makeshift graves. This constant physical reminder of the scale of the loss would have been deeply unsettling. It was as if parts of his own map, his own memory of the world, had been erased, leaving behind only eerie, silent voids where life once thrived. Let's step away from the peasant's perspective and look at those who tried to fight the disease directly. This brings us to the haunting and widely misunderstood figure of the plague doctor. When we picture a plague doctor, we imagine the iconic beaked mask and the long, dark coat. The image is one of a mysterious, almost mythical healer, bravely walking into infected houses. The reality, however, was far less heroic and far more grim. Most plague doctors were not highly trained physicians. The best doctors knew they couldn't cure the disease, and, if they could afford it, they fled the cities along with the wealthy. The men who took the job of plague doctor were often second-rate doctors, young physicians trying to establish a name, or people with no medical training at all who were simply willing to take the immense risk for a steady paycheck. Their primary role was not to cure, because no one knew how. Their main function was more administrative and statistical. They were hired and paid by the city council to go from house to house, not to treat the sick, but to count them. They were public servants whose job was to keep a tally of the dead for the public record. They would also be called upon to witness the last wills and testaments of the dying, as there were often no notaries or priests willing to enter an infected home. So when a plague doctor arrived at your door, it was not a sign of hope. It was a sign that you were now officially a statistic, a name to be added to the ever-growing list of the dead. Their presence was a confirmation of doom, not a promise of salvation. The famous costume, with its bird-like mask, was not actually widespread during the first and most devastating wave of the Black Death in the mid-1300s. It was developed much later, in the 17th century, by a French physician named Charles Delorme. But the idea behind it perfectly captures the medical understanding of the time. The prevailing theory was that the plague was spread by, quote, miasma, or bad air. It was believed that poisonous vapor rose from rotting matter and, when inhaled, caused the disease. Therefore, the long beak of the mask was not just for show, it was a primitive respirator. It was stuffed with aromatic herbs, flowers, and spices, things like mint, cloves, camphor, and lavender. The doctor would breathe only through this perfumed filter, believing it would protect him from the deadly miasma emanating from his patients. The rest of the costume was also a form of early personal protective equipment. The doctor wore a long overcoat made of waxed leather or canvas. The thinking was that this slick surface would prevent the miasma from sticking to his clothes. He wore gloves on his hands and often had a wide-brimmed hat, similar to what we associate with witch hunters, which was meant to further signify his official status. He carried a long wooden stick, which was a crucial tool. It allowed him to examine patients without actually touching them. He could use it to lift their bedclothes to look for the telltale swellings, or even to take their pulse from a distance. The stick was also used to keep desperate, grieving family members at a safe distance, creating a physical barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dying. The treatments offered by these doctors were, by modern standards, useless at best and harmful at worst. The core of medieval medicine was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness was believed to be caused by an imbalance of these humors. So the primary treatment for the plague was to try and rebalance them. This usually involved bloodletting, either by opening a vein or applying leeches. For a patient already weakened by fever, dehydration, and internal bleeding caused by the bacteria, this practice would have only hastened their death by causing further blood loss and shock. It was a complete and catastrophic misunderstanding of what was happening inside the body, but it was the only system they had to work with. Other cures were even more bizarre and desperate. Doctors would lance the painful buboes, the swollen lymph nodes in the groin or armpits, believing they were releasing the poison from the body. This was an excruciatingly painful procedure done without anesthetic, and it often just helped the infection spread more rapidly through the bloodstream. They also prescribed strange potions. Some were made of crushed minerals like emeralds or pearls. Others involved arsenic or mercury, which are potent poisons. One popular remedy was called theriac, a complex concoction that could contain over 60 ingredients, including viper flesh and opium. People clung to these remedies with desperate hope, but none of them worked. They were shots in the dark, fired by doctors who were just as terrified and ignorant as their patients. Because of their constant proximity to the dead and dying, and their strange bird-like appearance, the plague doctor became a figure of terror. They were often seen as omens of death itself. Their arrival in a neighborhood would cause panic. People would shutter their windows and bar their doors. While the doctor may have seen himself as a public servant doing a dangerous job, to the public he was a ghoul, a man who walked among the dead and profited from their demise. They lived isolated lives, often forced to quarantine themselves when not working. They were essential, but they were also outcasts, symbols of the very disease they were supposed to be fighting. Their haunting silhouette became inextricably linked with the horror of the plague for centuries to come. Ultimately, the plague doctor represents the absolute helplessness of humanity in the face of the Black Death. He was the embodiment of the limits of human knowledge. He wore his elaborate costume, carried his medical stick, and performed his useless treatments, all in a desperate attempt to impose order and understanding on something that was completely beyond his control. He was a man armed with perfume and superstition, fighting a microscopic bacterial enemy he couldn't see or even imagine. This image is a stark reminder that for the people living through this time, the plague wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a metaphysical one. It shattered their faith in medicine, in the church, and in the very idea that the world was a rational, understandable place. A common misconception is that the Black Death was a single terrible event that swept through Europe and then disappeared. The brutal truth is that it was not a singular storm, but the beginning of a new and terrifying climate. The plague did not go away after the first devastating wave of 1347 to 1351. It returned again and again for centuries. It became a recurring nightmare, a permanent shadow hanging over life in the late Middle Ages. After the first wave passed, there was a period of fragile recovery. The survivors, like our farmer Thomas, started to rebuild their lives. They remarried, had children, and tried to establish a new sense of normalcy. There was a baby boom in the years immediately following the plague, a biological and psychological response to so much death. But just as a new generation was being born, the plague would return. An outbreak hit in the 1360s, then again in the 1370s, and so on, roughly once every 10 to 20 years. These subsequent waves were often not as widespread as the initial pandemic, but they were just as deadly for the communities they struck. And cruelly, some of these later outbreaks seemed to target the young. One of the most devastating recurrences was the pestilence of 1361, which was known in England as the pestilence of children. For reasons that are still not fully understood, this wave was particularly fatal to infants and children, the very generation that was supposed to rebuild the depleted population. For the survivors of the first wave, this was a unique and profound cruelty. They had endured the apocalypse, only to watch the future they were trying to build be stolen from them. Imagine the psychological effect of this constant recurrence. How could you make any long-term plans? Why invest in a business, or carefully cultivate a farm, or even form deep attachments to your children, when you knew that the great mortality could sweep through at any moment and take everything away? It created a culture of deep-seated anxiety and fatalism. People searched for patterns, for warnings. They looked to the alignment of the stars, to unusual weather, to reports of plagues in distant lands, constantly on edge, waiting for the next return. The ringing of a church bell in the middle of the day could send a shiver of fear through a whole town, as people wondered if it was tolling for the first victim of a new outbreak. The trauma was never allowed to heal. It was reopened with each new wave of the disease. This constant threat shaped public policy. Cities in Italy, which were hit early and hard, developed the first organized public health responses. They created boards of health, committees of citizens who were given extraordinary powers during an outbreak. They could shut the city gates, close down markets, and, most importantly, they invented the concept of the quarantine. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. When a ship arrived from a place suspected of having the plague, it would be forced to anchor away from the port for 40 days. No people or goods could come ashore until this isolation period was over. It was a blunt instrument, based on the biblical concept of a 40-day period of purification, but it was the first systematic attempt to contain the spread of infectious disease. On a more personal level, cities also created a system of pest houses, or lazarettos. These were hospitals located outside the city walls, specifically for isolating plague victims. If someone in a household showed symptoms, the entire family would be forcibly removed from their home by health officials. The sick person would be taken to the pest house, a place from which very few ever returned. The rest of the family, even if they were healthy, would be locked inside their own home, which would be marked with a large red cross on the door to warn others away. They would be sealed in for 40 days. Guards would be posted outside to prevent them from escaping. Food would be passed to them through a window. It was a brutal but pragmatic system, sacrificing the liberty of a few families for the safety of the entire city. Imagine the terror of that red cross appearing on your door. You are healthy, but your child has a fever. Suddenly, you hear a heavy pounding. The door is forced open, and officials in waxed coats carry your screaming child away. Then the door is bolted from the outside. You are a prisoner in your own home. All you can do is wait, listen to the sounds of the dying city outside, and pray. You pray that your child somehow survives the pest house, and you pray that you and the rest of your family don't develop the symptoms yourselves. Every cough, every headache, every feeling of warmth becomes a source of terror. The 40 days would feel like a lifetime. a slow-motion nightmare where your own home has become your potential tomb. This recurring cycle of plague also had a profound impact on faith. During the first wave, many people turned to the church, believing the plague was a divine punishment for humanity's sins. They prayed, they fasted, they went on pilgrimages. But when the plague returned again and again, killing the pious and the sinner alike, that certainty began to waver. The church could not explain why the pestilence kept coming back. Priests and bishops died just as frequently as everyone else. Their prayers seemed to have no effect. This led to a growing disillusionment with the established church as an institution. People did not necessarily lose their faith in God, but they lost their faith in the power and authority of the church on earth. This subtle shift helped pave the way for the religious upheaval of the Reformation a century and a half later. Now let's focus on a very specific consequence of the plague, a testament to its power to erase history. We are going to visit a village. Let's call it Oakhaven. It's a typical English village in the early 1300s, nestled in a small green valley. It has a stone church, a watermill, a manor house for the local lord, and about 30 simple peasant cottages made of wattle and daub. Around 200 people live here. Life is hard, dictated by the seasons and the demands of the Lord, but it is stable. Generations of the same families have lived and died in Oakhaven. They know every field, every stream, every old tree. The village is their entire world, a living community, held together by bonds of kinship, duty, and shared history. In the summer of 1349, the plague arrives in Oakhaven. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic fleet of ghost ships like it did in the port cities. It arrives quietly, carried by a traveling friar seeking shelter for the night, or perhaps by a villager who visited a nearby market town to sell wool. The first to die is a woman in a cottage on the edge of the village. Her family attributes her sudden, violent illness and death to a bad fever. A few days later, her husband and 2 children are also dead. Panic begins to set in. The villagers have heard whispers of the great pestilence that is ravaging the country, but they prayed it would not find their secluded valley. Now, it is here. They bar their doors, avoid their neighbors, and look at each other with suspicion and fear. The village priest, a kind but terrified man named Father John, does his best to offer comfort. He goes from cottage to cottage, offering prayers and last rites to the dying. He knows the risk he is taking, but it is his duty. Within a week, he too develops a fever and the telltale swellings. He dies alone in the small house next to the church. His death is a devastating blow to the community. He was their spiritual guide, their connection to God. With his death, it feels as if God has truly abandoned Oakhaven. There is no one left to bless the dead, no one to offer a comforting word. The social and spiritual heart of the village has been ripped out. The death of the priest marks the beginning of the end for the village. The plague sweeps through the remaining cottages with horrifying speed. Families that had lived in Oakhaven for 200 years are completely wiped out in a matter of days. The social structure dissolves into pure survival instinct. Those who are still healthy enough flee, abandoning their homes and their sick relatives, hoping to outrun the invisible enemy. They take to the roads, but often they carry the disease with them, spreading it to the next village on their path. Others simply give up, lock themselves in their homes, and wait for death to take them. The sounds of life, children playing, the blacksmith's hammer, the miller's wheel, are replaced by an eerie, profound silence, broken only by the wind. Within a few months, Oakhaven is effectively dead. Out of a population of 200, perhaps only a dozen survive. They are scattered, traumatized, and alone. There are not enough people left to farm the fields, to mill the grain, to maintain the cottages. The village is no longer a viable community. The remaining survivors drift away, seeking refuge with distant relatives in other towns, or looking for work on estates that were spared the worst of the plague. They leave everything behind, their homes, their possessions, the graves of their families. They walk away from Oakhaven and never look back because the memory is simply too painful. The village is left to the mercy of nature. Over the next few years, nature begins to reclaim Oakhaven. Thatch roofs rot and collapse. The carefully plowed fields become overgrown with weeds and then slowly revert to pasture and then scrubland. Saplings take root in the middle of the old village green. The wattle and daub walls of the cottages crumble, melting back into the earth until only the faint outline of their foundations remains. The only structure that stands for any length of time is the stone church, but eventually its roof also falls in, and ivy grows over its walls. Within a generation or two, a traveler passing through the valley might see nothing but a few grassy mounds and the crumbling ruin of a church tower. They would have no idea that a thriving community once existed here. Oakhaven has become a lost village, its memory erased from the landscape. There are thousands of these lost villages across Europe, particularly in England and Germany. They are known today as, quote, deserted medieval villages. For centuries, they were just local curiosities, strange lumps and bumps in a farmer's field, sometimes attributed to fairies or ancient Britons. It was only with the advent of modern aerial photography and archaeology that their true nature was revealed. These faint outlines in the grass are the ghosts of communities that were killed by the Black Death. They are the most poignant and enduring memorials to the plague, a silent testament to its power to not just kill people, but to wipe entire communities, with all their history and culture, completely off the map. Each one of those grassy outlines was once a home, filled with a family's hopes, fears, and daily struggles. Let's look at the legal and economic aftermath for the lord of a place like Oakhaven. Assuming he survived by isolating himself in his manor house, he now faces a new kind of crisis. His entire workforce is gone. His fields are unplowed, his rents are uncollected, his wealth has vanished overnight because it was based on the labor of people who no longer exist. He now owns a vast, empty, and unproductive tract of land. To attract new tenants, he must offer incredible terms: extremely low rents, long leases, freedom from the old, burdensome labor duties. He is forced to compete for the few surviving peasants who can now pick and choose where they want to work. The power dynamic has been completely inverted. In this way, the plague acted as a brutal but effective agent of land reform. The disappearance of so much arable farmland also led to a shift in the entire agricultural economy. With not enough people to plow and harvest crops like wheat and barley, which are very labor-intensive, landowners switched to something that required far fewer workers: sheep farming. Vast tracts of former cropland were converted into pasture for sheep. This had long-term consequences for England's economy, as it fueled the growth of the wool trade, which would become a major source of the nation's wealth for centuries to come. So, the green rolling hills of the English countryside, dotted with grazing sheep, an image we think of as timeless, are in many ways a direct result of the demographic catastrophe of the Black Death. It's a peaceful landscape born from an almost unimaginable trauma. Let's turn our attention to the cities again, and to a different kind of survivor. Not everyone reacted to the plague with piety or fatalistic revelry. For some, the chaos was an opportunity. With the normal social order completely broken down, and law enforcement either dead or in hiding, the cities became a breeding ground for crime. Burglary was rampant. Ghoulish thieves, known as plague robbers, would move through the streets at night, breaking into the homes of the sick and the dead to steal anything of value. They would strip the clothes and jewelry from corpses, showing a complete disregard for the dead and the immense risk of infection to themselves. It was a desperate, dangerous form of opportunism, born from the total collapse of societal norms. These robbers were both reviled and feared. They were seen as profiting from the misery of others, violating the most sacred taboos. There were gruesome stories and legends about them. One famous tale, which probably has some basis in fact, is the story of the Four Thieves. The legend says that a group of 4 spice merchants who had lost their business during the plague turned to robbing the dead. They were remarkably successful and seemed to be immune to the disease. When they were finally caught and brought before the king, he offered them a pardon if they would reveal their secret. They explained that they used a powerful herbal concoction, a vinegar infused with herbs like sage, rosemary, and garlic, which they would rub on their hands, faces, and in their nostrils before entering a sick person's house. This recipe became known as 4 Thieves' Vinegar, and for centuries it was sold as a protective tonic against disease. While it certainly didn't cure the plague, the herbs they used, particularly garlic, do have some antiseptic and antibacterial properties. And the vinegar itself may have acted as a mild flea repellent. So their secret wasn't magic, but a combination of a primitive form of disinfectant and probably a great deal of luck. The legend is a fascinating example of how people tried to find some sort of logic or secret knowledge that could offer protection in a world where official medicine and religion had so clearly failed. They were looking for any kind of agency, any way to feel in control, even if it was just a folk remedy whispered about in the marketplace. Beyond simple theft, the plague also created opportunities for more sophisticated fraud. With so many people dying so quickly, often without a formal will, proving ownership of property became incredibly difficult. A clever and unscrupulous survivor could forge documents, claiming to be the long-lost cousin or the secret heir of a wealthy merchant who had died, along with his entire immediate family. With all the official record keepers dead and the courts in chaos, it was difficult for anyone to challenge these claims. A person could go from being a penniless apprentice to a wealthy property owner in a matter of months through pure audacity and forgery. The plague churned the social order, not just by creating a labor shortage, but by creating a chaotic legal vacuum where fortunes could be made by the bold and the dishonest. This chaos extended to the church as well. The plague had killed a huge percentage of the clergy, particularly the dedicated local priests who stayed to tend to their flock. This created a massive shortage of qualified priests. To fill the empty positions, the church was forced to lower its standards dramatically. They began ordaining young, poorly educated men who would never have been considered for the priesthood before the plague. Many of these new priests could barely read Latin, the language of the service, and had little understanding of theology. This led to a marked decline in the quality and reputation of the clergy. The laity, the common people, saw these new priests as ignorant and sometimes corrupt, further eroding their respect for the institutional church. Let's consider the children who survived. Many were orphaned, their entire families wiped out by the disease. In a world with no formal orphanages or social safety net, their future was incredibly precarious. Some were taken in by distant relatives, often seen as just another mouth to feed. Others were left to fend for themselves, forming small gangs of street children in the cities, surviving by begging and stealing. But the plague also spurred a new wave of charitable thinking. Wealthy merchants and nobles who had survived, often feeling a mix of guilt and gratitude, began to endow new institutions in their wills. They founded chantries to pray for the souls of the dead, but they also founded schools and almshouses, creating some of the first organized charities to care for the orphans and the new poor created by the disaster. The experience of living through the plague as a child would have been uniquely terrifying. Imagine being 5 or 6 years old, your entire world confined to your home and your street. Suddenly, your parents and siblings fall ill with a terrifying sickness. You don't understand what is happening. You watch them die in agony. You might be the only one in the house left alive, alone with the bodies of your family for days, until the cart collectors come. The psychological trauma of such an experience is almost impossible for us to comprehend. These children would have carried those scars for the rest of their lives, creating a generation haunted by memories of loss and abandonment on a scale that we can barely imagine. This deep, foundational trauma undoubtedly shaped the society that emerged from the plague. The plague also had a strange and unexpected effect on women's roles in society. With so many men dead, women were needed to fill roles that had previously been closed to them. A widow might take over her husband's business, whether it was a bakery, a tannery, or a merchant's shop. She would become the head of the household and a business owner in her own right. For a brief period, women found new economic opportunities and a greater degree of independence than they had ever had before. This was not the result of a progressive social movement, but of pure demographic necessity. However, this period of opportunity was relatively short-lived. As the population began to recover, society gradually pushed women back into more traditional domestic roles, but the memory of that temporary freedom lingered. The universities and centers of learning were also devastated. Students and professors, living in close, often unsanitary quarters, were hit particularly hard. Entire colleges were closed down. This led to a huge loss of knowledge and a break in the tradition of scholarship. When the universities did reopen, there was a noticeable shift in the way people thought. The old way of thinking, known as scholasticism, which was based on logic and deference to ancient authorities like Aristotle, seemed inadequate to explain the catastrophe that had just occurred. A new way of thinking began to emerge, one that was more focused on human experience, on observation of the natural world, and on classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome. This movement, known as humanism, was a key ingredient in the intellectual flourishing of the Renaissance. It's tempting to think that after facing such a universal and indiscriminate enemy, humanity would have come together. But the Black Death also fueled xenophobia and division. We've already discussed the horrific persecution of Jewish communities, who were falsely blamed for the plague. But this suspicion extended to any outsider. A traveler arriving in a new town was seen not as a guest, but as a potential carrier of the disease. Towns would barricade themselves, refusing entry to all strangers. This created a world that was more fearful, more suspicious, and more insular. The shared experience of the plague did not create a sense of shared humanity. In many ways, it reinforced tribal identities and the fear of the other, as people clung to the safety of their own small, isolated communities. Let's think about the language people used. The plague introduced new words and phrases into the lexicon. Words like pestilence, contagion, and quarantine became part of everyday speech. The nursery rhyme, "Ring Around the Rosie," is often thought to be about the plague, though its origins are disputed by historians. The rosy refers to the red rash-like spots on the skin. The pocketful of posies refers to the herbs people carried to ward off the miasma. And ashes, ashes, we all fall down, is a stark reference to death and cremation. Whether the rhyme is truly from that period or not, its persistence shows how the plague embedded itself deep within the cultural memory, turning a world-ending catastrophe into a seemingly innocent children's song, a chilling echo of a forgotten trauma. The psychological toll was not just fear, but a pervasive sense of guilt among the survivors. This is a common feature of what we now call survivor's guilt. People would constantly ask themselves the unanswerable question, why did I survive when my wife, my children, my neighbors all died? In a world that believed everything happened for a reason, according to God's plan, this question was tormenting. Some believed they must have been spared for a divine purpose. Others feared they had been overlooked by God, or that they were sinners who were not worthy of being taken to heaven. This profound and unsettling guilt could manifest as extreme piety, as people dedicated the rest of their lives to prayer and good works, or it could manifest as deep depression and despair. The plague even changed how people ate. With a smaller population, there was a surplus of food. The price of grain, the staple of the peasant diet, fell dramatically. At the same time, the price of livestock often rose due to the difficulty of managing herds with fewer people. This meant that for the average survivor, their diet actually improved. They could afford to eat more meat, more dairy products like cheese and butter, and drink more ale. For the first time, Many common people had access to a richer and more varied diet than their parents could have ever dreamed of. This is another of the strange ironies of the Black Death. For those who were lucky enough to live through it, life in the aftermath was, in some material ways, significantly better than it had been before. Now let's visit another place. A small community that tried a different strategy. While most towns and villages were caught completely by surprise, the village of Eyam in Derbyshire, England, faced a later outbreak in 1665 with a conscious and ultimately heroic decision. When the plague arrived in the village, brought in a bundle of flea-infested cloth from London, the villagers knew exactly what they were facing. The stories of the Great Pestilence were still fresh in their cultural memory. Their rector, a man named William Mompesson, convinced the villagers to do something extraordinary. He persuaded them to quarantine the entire village, to cut themselves off from the outside world completely, in order to prevent the disease from spreading to the surrounding countryside. This was a decision of almost unbelievable courage and self-sacrifice. The villagers of Eyam knew that by sealing themselves in, many, if not most of them, would die. They were essentially agreeing to face the plague alone, to contain it within their own community. They set up a boundary of stones around the village, and no one was allowed to cross it, in or out. Neighboring villages, coordinated by a nearby earl, left food and supplies for them at designated points along this boundary line. The villagers of Eyam would come to these points and leave money in a trough filled with vinegar, which they believed would disinfect the coins. This allowed them to trade for necessities without making direct human contact, a desperate attempt to maintain a lifeline to the outside world. For over a year, from the summer of 1665 to the autumn of 1666, the village of Eyam became its own isolated world of sickness and death. The plague raged through the small community. Families buried their own dead in their gardens or in nearby fields as the churchyard quickly filled up. The rector, Mompesson, continued to hold church services, but he held them in the open air, in a natural stone amphitheater, so that his parishioners could stand far apart from one another to minimize the risk of infection. He preached sermons of hope and resilience to a dwindling congregation, his own wife being one of the victims. It was a community that, in the face of certain death, chose to maintain its social bonds and its faith, even as it was being systematically destroyed. The personal stories from Eyam are heartbreaking. There is the story of Elizabeth Hancock, who buried her husband and all 6 of her children with her own hands in the space of a single week. Because no one else dared to help her, she had to drag their bodies one by one from her farmhouse to a small plot of land for burial. There is the story of Roland Torre, a farmer who lived just outside the quarantine line. His sweetheart, a young woman from the village, was trapped inside. They would meet secretly at the boundary, calling to each other across a small stream, unable to touch or comfort each other, until one day she stopped coming. These individual tragedies, repeated over and over, made up the collective sacrifice of the village. When the plague finally burned itself out and the quarantine was lifted, the cost was staggering. Out of a population of around 350 people, an estimated 260 had died. The village had lost more than 70% of its inhabitants, but their sacrifice had worked. The plague had been contained within the valley. The surrounding towns and the major city of Sheffield had been spared. The story of Eyam is a stark contrast to the chaos and social breakdown that characterized so many communities during the first wave of the Black Death. It stands as a powerful, if tragic, example of a community making a conscious choice to protect the greater good, even at the cost of its own existence. It is a story of immense civic duty and human resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. Let's return to the 14th century, to the immediate aftermath of that first cataclysmic wave. The world was emptier, quieter, and fundamentally altered, but the bacteria that caused the plague, Yersinia pestis, had not disappeared. It had found a new home. While the black rat and its fleas were the primary carriers that brought the disease to Europe, the bacteria established itself in the local rodent populations across the continent. It created what are known as plague reservoirs in populations of marmots, gerbils, and other wild rodents, living in the vast, open spaces of Central Asia and even in parts of the Alps. This is why the disease never truly went away. It would lie dormant in these animal populations for years, and then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, it would flare up and spill back over into the human population, starting the cycle all over again. This scientific reality of plague reservoirs was, of course, completely unknown to the people of the 14th century. To them, the plague's return was a matter of mystery and divine will. They couldn't see the microscopic bacteria or the hidden rodent populations. They only saw the result, a terrifying disease that seemed to appear from nowhere, burn through a community, and then vanish as mysteriously as it arrived. This lack of a visible, understandable cause is what made it so profoundly terrifying. It wasn't like a war, where you could see your enemy. It wasn't like a famine, where you could point to the withered crops. The Black Death was an invisible, silent predator. This invisibility fueled the search for scapegoats and the belief in supernatural causes, because a world governed by unseen evil forces was, in some ways, more comforting than a world governed by pure, random, biological chance. Let's consider the long-term impact on the physical health of the survivors. You might assume that those who lived through the plague were simply the lucky ones. But recent archaeological studies of skeletons from this period have revealed a surprising truth. The generation born after the Black Death was, on average, healthier and lived longer than the generations that came before. Scientists examining bones from pre- and post-plague cemeteries have found that the post-plague population had a lower incidence of diseases like leprosy and tuberculosis. One theory is that the plague acted as a brutal agent of natural selection. It disproportionately killed the old, the very young, and those who were already weakened by other illnesses or malnutrition. The people who survived were, by definition, the hardiest and most robust members of the population, with stronger immune systems, and they passed these traits on to their children. This culling of the weakest members of the population, combined with the improved diet we discussed earlier, created a healthier gene pool. It's a grim and uncomfortable thought, but the Black Death, by eliminating so many people, inadvertently created the conditions for a stronger, more resilient human population in Europe. Furthermore, with fewer people competing for resources, the average person had more to eat. The improved nutrition in childhood led to people growing taller and being less susceptible to common illnesses. It is one of the most profound and disturbing ironies of this period. The greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded history may have laid the biological groundwork for the explosion of art, science, and exploration that we call the Renaissance. A healthier, better fed, and more resilient population was better equipped to build a new world from the ashes of the old. The plague didn't just affect the bodies of the survivors, it rewired their brains. The constant threat of sudden, arbitrary death changed the way people thought about time and risk. Before the plague, the economic world was largely conservative. A merchant might finance a single trading voyage at a time, a slow and cautious way of doing business. But in the post-plague world, with its labor shortages and volatile markets, a new kind of economic thinking began to emerge. Merchants and bankers had to become more innovative, more willing to take risks. They developed new business practices, such as double-entry bookkeeping, which allowed them to track their finances more accurately. They also pioneered the use of bills of exchange, a form of early paper money, which made long-distance trade easier and safer. These innovations were the foundation of modern capitalism, born from the need to adapt to a radically changed economic landscape. Let's zoom in on one of these new capitalists, a man we'll call Filippo. Before the plague, he was a minor wool merchant in Florence, struggling to compete with the big, established families. During the plague, his entire family, including his older brothers who were set to inherit the business, died. Filippo survived. He suddenly found himself the sole heir to a modest fortune and a business with no workers. Instead of giving up, he saw an opportunity. He used his inheritance to buy up the businesses of other merchants who had died, acquiring their workshops and their trade connections for a fraction of their real value. He offered high wages to attract the best surviving weavers and dyers. He diversified his investments, putting money not just into wool, but into silk, banking, and shipping. He was taking risks that would have been unthinkable before the plague, but in this new world, caution was no guarantee of safety. Filippo's story illustrates a broader shift. The old money, the established aristocratic families whose wealth was based on land and hereditary titles, were weakened by the plague. Their power base, the peasant labor that worked their land, had been decimated. A new class of wealthy and powerful men emerged: the entrepreneurs, the bankers, the merchants who were smart, ruthless, and lucky enough to navigate the chaos. These were self-made men, and their wealth was not based on land, but on liquid capital, on trade, on innovation. This new merchant class, particularly in the city-states of Italy like Florence and Venice, would become the great patrons of the arts and sciences during the Renaissance. They funded the work of artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, not out of pure altruism, but as a way to display their wealth, power, and piety, a new kind of aristocracy built on commerce, not on blood. The plague's influence can even be seen in the technology of the era. The sudden shortage of skilled laborers created a powerful incentive to develop labor-saving devices. One of the most significant of these was the printing press. Before the plague, books were copied by hand by scribes, a slow and expensive process. The plague killed a huge number of these highly skilled scribes. This created a bottleneck in the production of knowledge. The demand for books, particularly religious texts and university textbooks, was high, but the supply of people who could produce them was low. This created the perfect conditions for a technological solution. Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the printing press with movable type in the mid-15th century was a direct response to this need. It allowed books to be produced quickly, cheaply, and in huge quantities, democratizing knowledge and fueling the intellectual currents of the Renaissance and the Reformation. Let's trace the journey of the disease itself. We've talked a lot about its impact on Europe, but the Black Death was a global event. It did not begin in Italy in 1347. Its journey started much earlier and much farther east, on the vast, arid steppes of Central Asia. The bacterium, Yersinia pestis, had lived for centuries in populations of wild rodents like the marmot. For reasons that are still debated, perhaps a change in climate that forced the rodents out of their burrows, the disease began to spread more widely in the early 1300s. It was picked up by rats, traveling with merchants and armies along the Silk Road, the great network of trade routes that connected China and the East with the Mediterranean world. As it moved along these routes, it left a trail of devastation. By the 1330s, the plague was causing catastrophic outbreaks in China. Contemporary Chinese accounts describe a pestilence that was accompanied by earthquakes and floods, a sign of heavenly disfavor. It is estimated that the population of China fell by tens of millions during this period. The Mongol Empire, which controlled much of the Silk Road and had created an era of unprecedented trade and travel, ironically became the superspreader of the disease. The very thing that made the Mongol Empire so successful, its vast, interconnected network, also made it incredibly vulnerable. The plague destabilized the empire, contributing to its eventual collapse and changing the course of Asian history just as profoundly as it changed the course of European history. It was a truly global pandemic, one of the first in human history. The story of how the plague made the final jump to Europe is a dramatic and horrifying one. It centers on the Genoese trading post of Kaffa, a fortified city on the coast of the Black Sea in modern-day Crimea. In 1346, Kaffa was under siege by a Mongol army led by a Khan named Johnny Beg. During the long siege, the Mongol army was struck by the plague. Soldiers began dying in huge numbers. The siege began to falter. But Johnny Beg, in an act of what can only be described as early biological warfare, decided to use the disease as a weapon. He ordered his men to load the plague-ridden corpses of their comrades onto their catapults and launch them over the city walls. The rotting bodies arced through the air and landed in the streets of Kaffa, bringing the pestilence inside the besieged city. The horror and panic inside Kaffa must have been unimaginable. The Genoese defenders were trapped in a fortified city, now contaminated with a deadly and terrifying disease. They were being attacked from the outside by the Mongol army and from the inside by an invisible enemy. The plague spread rapidly through the city's population. The Genoese merchants, realizing their situation was hopeless, abandoned the city. They fled to their ships in the harbor and set sail for home, hoping to escape the pestilence. But it was too late. The plague was already on board with them, incubating in the bodies of sick sailors and in the fleas on the ship's rats. These fleeing ships, vessels of death, are the ones that would eventually arrive in ports like Messina, Genoa, and Venice, bringing the Black Death to Europe. This story, while dramatic, highlights the interconnectedness of the 14th century world. The plague was not a purely European phenomenon. It was the product of a global network of trade, travel, and conflict. The salt, spices, and silk that Europeans so desired came at a terrible price. The same routes that brought wealth and exotic goods to Europe also brought a microscopic organism that would bring the continent to its knees. The story of Kaffa serves as a powerful reminder that history is not a collection of isolated events happening in different parts of the world. It is a complex web of cause and effect, where a disease outbreak in a rodent population in Central Asia can, through a chain of human actions, lead to the death of a third of the population of Europe a decade later. Let's consider the three forms the disease took, because the Black Death was not one single illness, but a triple threat. The most common form, accounting for about 80% of cases, was the bubonic plague. This is the one we most often associate with the name. The fever, the chills, and the painful swollen lymph nodes, or buboes, in the armpits and groin. This form was transmitted by the bite of an infected flea. It was not directly contagious from person to person. You had to be bitten by a flea that had previously fed on an infected rodent or person. The mortality rate for bubonic plague was incredibly high, around 60 to 80%, but it was not a guaranteed death sentence. A small number of people, perhaps the ones with the strongest immune systems, did survive it. The second and much deadlier form was the pneumonic plague. This occurred when the Yersinia pestis bacteria managed to infect the lungs. Unlike the bubonic form, pneumonic plague was terrifyingly contagious. It could be spread directly from person to person through the air, by inhaling the respiratory droplets of an infected person when they coughed or sneezed. The symptoms were a high fever and a bloody cough, and death was almost certain, usually within 1 or 2 days. This is the form of the plague that likely caused the disease to spread so rapidly during the cold winter months, when people were crowded together indoors. A single person with pneumonic plague in a crowded church or a tavern could infect dozens of others in a very short time. Its mortality rate was effectively 100%. The third and rarest form was the septicemic plague. This occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, perhaps through a cut or a flea bite directly into a vein, and began to multiply there in huge numbers. There were often no buboes. The victim would experience a high fever, chills, and extreme weakness. The bacteria would cause a condition known as disseminated intravascular coagulation, where tiny blood clots form throughout the body. This would block blood flow to the organs and the skin, causing tissue to die. This is what caused the dark patches on the skin that gave the Black Death its name. Septicemic plague was also 100% fatal, and death could occur in less than a day, sometimes so quickly that the person died before any major symptoms had time to develop. It was the fastest and most terrifying form of the disease. The existence of these three forms helps to explain the sheer speed and terror of the pandemic. The bubonic form allowed it to be carried over long distances by rats on ships, establishing new footholds in port cities. But once it was established in a human population, the pneumonic form allowed it to spread with terrifying efficiency, independent of the rats and fleas, especially in crowded, urban environments. The septicemic form added another layer of horror, with its rapid, almost symptomless death. The people of the 14th century, of course, did not know about this triple nature. To them, it was all just the pestilence. They couldn't understand why some victims developed the telltale buboes while others just coughed up blood and died, or why the disease seemed to spread differently in the summer than in the winter. This unpredictability only added to the sense of chaos and fear. The plague also left fingerprints on our DNA. Modern geneticists have discovered that certain gene variants that are common in European populations today seem to have been selected for during the Black Death. Some of these genes are involved in the immune system, and it is believed that people who carried these particular variants were slightly more likely to survive the plague. They passed these protective genes on to their descendants, and over generations, these genes became more common in the population. However, this genetic legacy is a double-edged sword. Some of the same gene variants that may have offered protection against the plague are now known to be associated with an increased risk for autoimmune diseases, like Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis. Our ancestors' survival may have come at a cost to our own health. Let's talk about the animals. The Black Death was not just a human catastrophe. The bacterium Yersinia pestis can infect many species of mammals. Contemporary accounts describe mass die-offs of livestock. Sheep, cows, pigs, and even chickens and dogs were reported to have been struck down by the pestilence. This would have been a devastating economic blow for a peasant family. Their livestock was their most valuable possession, their source of food, milk, wool, and power for plowing the fields. Losing their animals would have been just as catastrophic as losing a family member, and in many cases, it meant the remaining human survivors would starve. The fields were not just empty of people. They were empty of the animals that were essential to the medieval agricultural economy. The one animal that seemed to be largely unaffected was the cat. This led to a strange and tragic irony. In the years leading up to the Black Death, there had been a period of religious fervor where cats, particularly black cats, were associated with witchcraft and devil worship. In some parts of Europe, there had been widespread killing of cats. With fewer cats around to hunt them, the population of black rats, the primary carriers of the plague's fleas, may have boomed. Then, during the plague, when people were desperate for any explanation, some turned their suspicion back on the animals. They believed that dogs and cats could carry the disease, and in some cities, there were organized massacres of pets, a completely useless measure that only served to kill one of the rat's main natural predators. The environmental impact of the plague was also significant. With a third of the population gone, there was a massive decrease in agricultural activity. Huge areas of farmland were abandoned and allowed to revert to forest. This process of reforestation on a continental scale had a measurable impact on the global climate. Trees absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The regrowth of Europe's forests after the Black Death may have absorbed enough carbon dioxide to contribute to a slight cooling of the planet, a phenomenon that scientists have observed in ice core samples from that period. It is a stark illustration of the sheer scale of the demographic collapse. So many people died that it literally changed the weather. The human footprint on the planet shrank dramatically for the first time in centuries. The experience of the plague also changed the way people viewed hospitals. Before the 14th century, a hospital was not primarily a place for medical treatment. It was more of a hospice or a house of charity, run by the church, where the poor and the terminally ill could go to be cared for and to die with a degree of dignity. They were places of spiritual care, more than physical healing. But the plague overwhelmed these institutions. The sheer number of sick and dying people forced a change in approach. Cities began to establish municipal hospitals, funded by the town council rather than the church, with a new focus on public health, isolation of the sick, and the enforcement of hygiene. This was the birth of the modern hospital as a secular, civic institution with a responsibility for managing public health crises. Let's look at the legal system. The Black Death created a lawyer's nightmare, or a dream, depending on your perspective. The sheer number of deaths created an unprecedented number of inheritance disputes. A person might die, followed by their children, followed by their brothers and sisters, all in the space of a few weeks. Figuring out who was the rightful heir to the family property became an incredibly complex puzzle. Wills were often made hastily on deathbeds, and were frequently contradictory or legally flawed. The courts were flooded with cases, and a new class of lawyers emerged who specialized in this complex and lucrative field of post-plague inheritance law. It was a grim business, sorting through the legal wreckage of dead families, but it was essential to re-establishing a sense of order. We often focus on the death toll, but what about the people who got sick and, against all odds, survived? What was their life like afterwards? They would have been left with physical scars, the permanent discolored marks where the buboes had been, but they would also have carried a certain social status. A survivor was seen as someone who had been tested by God and found worthy. They were also believed to be immune to the disease, which made them valuable. They could safely nurse sick relatives, or take on dangerous but essential jobs, like burying the dead. But their survival was also a constant, visible reminder of the plague's presence. Their scars were a map of the pain the community had endured, a living testament to the horror that had passed, and the fear that it could one day return. The plague's impact on warfare was also significant. For a time, it simply brought all conflicts to a halt. Armies were a perfect breeding ground for disease, with thousands of men living in close, unsanitary conditions. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which had been raging for a decade, ground to a stop for nearly 8 years. Both sides were too busy dealing with the pestilence at home to field an army. When the fighting did resume, it was in a changed world. The old model of a large army of feudal knights and peasant foot soldiers was becoming obsolete. The new reality of labor shortages and a shattered economy meant that kings had to find new, more efficient ways to wage war, relying more on smaller, professional armies and new technologies like the longbow and, eventually, gunpowder. Let's visit a monastery. Monks living in close-knit, self-contained communities were particularly vulnerable to the plague. Once the disease got inside the monastery walls, it could sweep through the entire population with terrifying speed. Some monasteries lost 80 to 90% of their members. This had a devastating impact on the preservation of knowledge. For centuries, monasteries had been the primary centers for copying and preserving ancient texts, both religious and classical. The death of so many skilled and educated monks meant that countless manuscripts were lost forever. It was a cultural catastrophe that ran parallel to the human one, a burning of a library that took place not with fire, but with fever. The psychological effect of this loss on the surviving monks was profound. Their faith was based on the idea that by withdrawing from the world and dedicating their lives to prayer, they were on a path to salvation. But the plague showed no respect for their devotion. It killed the devout monk just as easily as the worldly merchant. This led to a crisis of faith within the monastic orders. Some survivors became even more extreme in their piety, believing the plague was a punishment for not being devout enough. Others fell into despair, questioning the value of a life of prayer in a world that seemed so cruel and random. The very foundation of monasticism was shaken to its core. The art of memory was crucial in the medieval world, where books were rare. People were trained to remember vast amounts of information using complex mental techniques. The plague dealt a severe blow to this oral and mental tradition. The old men and women of a village, the living libraries who held the community's history, its folklore, its genealogies, were often the first to die. When they died, they took their knowledge with them. Entire histories and traditions vanished in a single generation. This created a sense of cultural amnesia, a break in the chain of memory that connected people to their past. The survivors were left in a world that was not only emptier of people, but also emptier of the stories that gave it meaning. Let's consider a single, poignant object: a will. In the years before 1347, a person's last will and testament was typically a calm, formulaic document. It would be drafted with care, often long before death was imminent. It would contain bequests to the church, to family members, and detailed instructions for the funeral. But the wills written during the plague years are different. They are short, frantic, and filled with a sense of panic. They are often written on scraps of parchment, sometimes by a barely literate priest, or even by the dying person themselves. They often begin with the phrase, "in this time of pestilence," or "being of sound mind but fearing the mortality." These documents are the last words of a terrified people, a direct and intimate window into the fear that gripped the world. The plague even changed the way people experienced time. In the medieval world, time was cyclical, governed by the seasons and the religious calendar. The year was marked by planting and harvesting, by Christmas and Easter. The Black Death introduced a new kind of time, apocalyptic time. People became obsessed with prophecies and signs of the end of the world. They believed they were living in the end times, described in the book of Revelation. This created a sense of urgency and dread, a feeling that the normal patterns of life were over and that humanity was on the brink of a final, divine judgment. This apocalyptic mindset would linger for generations, fueling religious movements and social unrest. Consider the sense of smell. The medieval world was already a pungent place, but the plague added a new and terrifying layer to the sensory landscape. The dominant smell in a plague-stricken city would have been the smell of death. The sick gave off a specific, sweet, and foul odor, and the sheer number of unburied bodies would have created an overwhelming stench that permeated everything. This is why people carried posies of flowers and pomanders of spices. It was not just about the miasma theory. It was a desperate attempt to block out the constant, nauseating smell of death to create a small pocket of clean, pleasant air in a world that smelled like a graveyard. The smell itself was a form of psychological torture. The Black Death was also a story of incredible resilience. Amidst the horror and chaos, there were countless acts of courage and compassion. There were the priests, like Father John in our fictional village of Oakhaven, who stayed to care for their flock, knowing it would cost them their lives. There were the doctors who, despite having no effective cures, continued to visit the sick. And there were the ordinary people who cared for their sick family members, who shared their meager food supplies with their neighbors, who took in orphaned children. These stories are often lost in the grand narrative of death and destruction, but they are just as important. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, humanity's capacity for kindness and self-sacrifice endures. Let's look at a specific group of people who played a crucial and often overlooked role: the women who served as nurses and caregivers. In a world with few doctors and hospitals, the vast majority of care for the sick was provided at home by women, mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters. They were the frontline workers of the Black Death. They were the ones who sat with the dying, who bathed their feverish bodies, who cleaned their sores, who offered them water and words of comfort. They did this without any protective equipment, without any real understanding of the disease, armed only with traditional herbal remedies and immense bravery. The death toll among women was incredibly high, a direct result of their role as the primary caregivers of the sick. The plague also had a significant impact on exploration. By the late 15th century, the population of Europe had finally recovered to its pre-plague levels, but the world had changed. The old Silk Road trade routes, which had been disrupted by the collapse of the Mongol Empire and the lingering fear of plague from the east, were no longer as reliable. European nations, particularly Portugal and Spain, began to look for new sea routes to Asia to bypass the old overland routes. This quest for a new way to the spices and silks of the East would lead directly to the Age of Discovery. Columbus's voyage in 1492 was, in a distant but direct way, a consequence of the Black Death. The plague had reoriented Europe's relationship with the rest of the world, forcing it to look outward, across the oceans. Let's think about the children who were born in the years immediately after the first wave. They grew up in a world that was haunted. They would have played in empty houses and walked down streets where half the families were gone. They would have heard stories from their parents about the terrible time of the Great Mortality. This sense of living in the shadow of a catastrophe would have been a defining feature of their childhood. They were the first generation of a new, emptier, and strangely richer world. They inherited the property and the opportunities left behind by the dead. But they also inherited the trauma, the fear, and the knowledge that the world was a fragile and dangerous place. The plague forced a confrontation with the reality of the human body. Medieval art was typically very stylized and symbolic. But in the aftermath of the plague, there was a new interest in realism and anatomy. Artists and doctors began to dissect human bodies, something that had previously been taboo, in a desperate attempt to understand the cause of the disease. This new anatomical knowledge found its way into art. Paintings and sculptures began to depict the human body with a new, startling accuracy. This fascination with the mechanics of the body, born from the desire to understand the mechanics of death, was another key element of the Renaissance's intellectual revolution. Consider the sheer silence. A medieval village was a noisy place. The sounds of animals, the church bell, the blacksmith's hammer, people shouting and children playing. A city was even louder. The plague brought a profound and eerie quiet. A survivor walking through their own town would have been struck by the unnatural silence. This absence of the normal sounds of human life would have been deeply unsettling, a constant auditory reminder of the absence of people. The world would have seemed muted, as if its volume had been turned down. This silence would have been the soundtrack to the survivors, grief and loneliness. The Black Death was not the end of the world, but it was the end of a world. It was the end of the High Middle Ages, with its sense of stability, its rigid social hierarchy, and its unquestioning faith in the established order. The world that emerged from the plague was more chaotic, more dynamic, more modern. The individual had a new sense of their own worth and power. The old institutions had been weakened. New ideas in art, science, religion, and economics were taking root. The Black Death was a destructive fire that cleared away the old growth, and in the fertile, ash-rich soil it left behind, the seeds of the modern world began to grow. It was a brutal, agonizing, and transformative birth. The sheer number of deaths put an incredible strain on the supply of coffins and burial shrouds. In the early days of an outbreak, people tried to maintain the proper Christian burial rituals. But as the death toll mounted, these rituals collapsed. There simply weren't enough healthy people to dig the graves, enough wood to make the coffins, or enough cloth to wrap the bodies. This is when the plague pits were dug. The abandonment of these sacred rituals was a source of profound spiritual anxiety. People feared that a body that was not properly buried, without the correct prayers, could not find its way to heaven. The plague was not just killing their bodies, it was threatening the salvation of their souls. The plague also exposed the class divisions in society in a stark way. While it was called the, quote, great equalizer, the wealthy did have a better chance of survival. They had the means to flee the crowded, unsanitary cities and isolate themselves in their country estates. They had better food and were generally in better health to begin with. However, their flight often doomed the cities they left behind. By abandoning their posts, the nobles, city officials, and wealthy merchants created a power vacuum that led to the complete breakdown of law and order. Their survival came at the cost of the social fabric they were supposed to lead and protect. The fear of contagion changed the very architecture of cities in the long run. In the centuries after the Black Death, There was a new emphasis on sanitation and public health in urban planning. New regulations were passed concerning waste disposal. Streets were widened to allow for better air circulation. Quarantine stations and plague hospitals were built as permanent structures on the outskirts of cities. The memory of the plague forced a slow but steady revolution in urban design, driven by the understanding that the layout of a city could either help or hinder the spread of a deadly disease. The clean, orderly cities of the Renaissance were a direct reaction against the crowded, chaotic, and vulnerable cities of the Middle Ages. Let's consider the story of a single object again, a silver coin. Before the plague, this coin might have been hoarded by a peasant family, a small life savings. During the plague, it might have been used to bribe a cart collector to take away a body, or left in a vinegar-filled trough in Ayam in exchange for bread. After the plague, it might have been part of the first real wages a surviving peasant ever earned. That single coin would have passed through hands that were grieving, terrified, and hopeful. Its journey would tell the story of the collapse of one economic system and the birth of another. It is a silent witness to the profound social and economic transformation that the plague unleashed. The scale of the death toll is something that is difficult for us to truly grasp. In many parts of Europe, the population did not recover to its pre-plague levels for over 200 years. Imagine a country losing between a third and a half of its entire population in the space of 3 or 4 years. It is a demographic shock on a scale that has no parallel in modern history, not even in the great wars of the 20th century. This vast emptiness, this world with too few people, was the defining reality for generations. Every aspect of life, from farming to family structure to faith, was shaped by the simple, stark fact of this massive continent-wide depopulation. Let's visit a university library after the plague. Many of the books would be untouched, the ink faded, the parchment gathering dust. The scholars who had read them and taught from them were gone. A new generation of scholars would have to rediscover this knowledge, but they would read these old texts with new eyes. They were less willing to simply accept the word of the ancient authorities. They had seen that the old knowledge had been powerless to stop the plague. This created a healthy skepticism, a new willingness to question, to observe, and to experiment. This critical spirit was the engine of the scientific revolution. It began in the quiet, empty libraries of a world recovering from trauma. The plague also had an impact on the construction of the great cathedrals of Europe. Many of these massive, multi-generational projects ground to a halt as the skilled stonemasons and artisans died. When construction did resume, sometimes decades later, it was often in a new architectural style. You can sometimes see a physical line in the stonework of a cathedral where the building stopped during the plague years and started again after with a different design. These great churches are not just monuments to faith, they are also archaeological records of the plague, with the scars of the great mortality literally carved into their stones, a silent testament to the generation of builders who never saw their work completed. The pop culture of the time was full of stories about the plague. The most famous is the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. It's a collection of 100 stories told by a group of 7 young women and 3 young men who have fled Florence to a secluded villa to escape the plague. While the frame story is about the horror of the Black Death, the stories they tell each other are often lively, funny, and very worldly. It's a book about the resilience of the human spirit. It shows people responding to the horror not just with prayer and fear, but with storytelling, with art, with a celebration of life and love. It's a powerful statement that even in the face of death, people will find a way to create and to connect. Let's end this part of our journey by thinking about the name. During the time, it was not called the Black Death. It was called the Great Mortality, the Great Pestilence, or simply the Pestilence. The name Black Death only became common several centuries later. But it is a fitting name. It refers not only to the dark spots on the skin of the victims, but also to the profound darkness and despair that the pandemic brought to the world. It was a blackness that blotted out the sun, that extinguished the lives of millions, and that left a permanent shadow on the soul of a civilization. Understanding this event is not just about understanding history, it's about understanding the fragility of society and the resilience of humanity in the face of its greatest challenges. The concept of a good death was central to medieval Christianity. A good death was one that was prepared for. You would have time to confess your sins to a priest, to receive the last rites, and to say goodbye to your family. It was a calm, orderly transition from the earthly life to the afterlife. The plague destroyed this. Death came so quickly and violently that there was no time for these rituals. People died alone, in terror, without a priest. This was a source of immense spiritual fear. People worried that without a proper confession, they would be doomed to an eternity in hell. This fear of a bad death was almost as terrifying as the fear of the physical suffering of the disease itself. This fear led to the popularity of a new kind of book called the Ars Moriendi, or The Art of Dying. These were short, illustrated manuals that gave advice to lay people on how to achieve a good death without the help of a priest. They included prayers to say, temptations to avoid, and questions the dying person should ask themselves to ensure they were right with God. These books were a form of spiritual first aid kit. They empowered ordinary people to take control of their own spiritual destiny in a time when the official church was overwhelmed and often absent. It was another small step in the long process of religious belief becoming more personal and less dependent on the institutional church. The experience of the plague survivors could be compared to that of soldiers returning from a brutal war. They suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They would have had flashbacks, nightmares, and a pervasive sense of anxiety. They lived in a state of constant alert, waiting for the return of the invisible enemy. This collective, unresolved trauma shaped the art, the religion, and the politics of the late 14th and 15th centuries. It created a society that was more cynical, more anxious, but also more questioning, and, in some ways, more alive to the preciousness and fragility of life. Ultimately, the brutal truth about living through the Black Death is that it was a profoundly lonely experience. The disease shattered the bonds of community and family, the very things that are supposed to sustain us in times of crisis. It forced people into isolation, to die alone or to survive alone, surrounded by the ghosts of everyone they had ever known. It was a psychological ordeal as much as a physical one. And it is this deep, personal loneliness, this sense of being abandoned by both God and man, that is perhaps the most difficult and most important part of the story for us to understand. It was a quiet, personal apocalypse, repeated millions of times over, in the silent, shuttered rooms of a dying world. This profound loneliness was not just a feeling, it was a practical reality that reshaped the very idea of family and community. In the aftermath, a survivor looking to rebuild their life, perhaps a widower looking for a new wife, would be choosing from a pool of people who were all equally traumatized. Every new relationship was haunted by the ghosts of the old one. A man might look at his new wife and see the face of the wife he lost. A woman might hold her new baby and feel the agonizing absence of the children the plague took from her. Trust was fragile. People had seen their neighbors, their friends, and even their own family members abandon the sick out of terror. How could you ever fully trust someone again, knowing what raw fear could do to human decency? These new families were built on a foundation of shared grief, a quiet, fragile alliance against a world that had proven itself to be utterly hostile. Let's imagine the experience of a notary in a city like Siena, Italy. We'll call him Piero. Before the plague, his job was a respectable, if somewhat dull, affair. He drafted contracts for merchants, recorded land sales, and occasionally drew up the will of an elderly person. But during the plague, his office became the city's confessional. He was one of the few literate officials who did not flee. Day after day, a line of terrified, desperate people would form outside his door. They came to make their last wills, their hands trembling as they dictated their final wishes. Piero's job was to listen, to write, and to bear witness. He heard stories of unimaginable loss, of bitter family feuds, of secret debts, and of desperate acts of charity. He became the keeper of the city's dying secrets, his pen scratching across the parchment as he recorded the last words of a collapsing civilization. Piero's work was a catalogue of human misery. He would record the will of a wealthy merchant in the morning, a man leaving a fortune in property and gold, and in the afternoon, he would find that same merchant's name being added to the list of the dead. He saw entire family trees wiped out in a matter of days. He would write a will for a father, and the next day the son would come to amend it, as he was now the sole heir, and then a few days later a cousin would appear, as the son too had died. The ink on one will was barely dry before it was rendered meaningless by the next death. For Piero, the plague was not an abstract number, it was a stack of documents, each one representing a life extinguished, a family shattered. He worked until his fingers were cramped and his soul was numb, the formal, legal language of the documents, a thin shield against the overwhelming tide of grief that flowed through his office every day. While the common people saw the plague as a punishment from God, the educated elite tried desperately to find a rational, scientific explanation. They were just as terrified, but their worldview demanded a cause that could be found in the natural world. The medical faculty at the University of Paris, at the request of the King of France, produced one of the most famous reports on the plague. After careful study, they concluded that the ultimate cause was a specific and unfortunate alignment of the planets. They wrote that on March 20th, 1345, there had been a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the house of Aquarius. This rare celestial event, they argued, had drawn up evil vapors from the Earth, particularly from swamps and unburied corpses, which then corrupted the atmosphere and caused the pestilence. This was the best science of the day, a sophisticated attempt to explain the catastrophe using the principles of astrology and natural philosophy. This astrological explanation may seem absurd to us, but it was a serious and influential theory. It was based on the belief that the planets influenced events on Earth, a core part of the medieval understanding of the cosmos. Other theories were also proposed. Some scholars looked to the Earth itself for an answer. They pointed to reports of recent earthquakes and volcanic eruptions in distant lands. They argued that these events had released poisonous gases from deep within the Earth, which were then carried across the globe by the wind. They were not entirely wrong. They were just looking at the wrong scale. They were searching for a vast, visible cause, like a planetary alignment or a volcanic eruption, because the true cause, a microscopic bacterium carried by fleas on rats, was too small, too mundane, and too terrifyingly random for them to even conceive of. Their failure shows the absolute limit of human knowledge in a pre-microscopic world. The plague's impact on the family unit was complex and contradictory. On one hand, it shattered families through death. On the other hand, it forced the creation of new, blended families at a rapid rate. With such high mortality, the pressure to remarry quickly was immense, both for emotional companionship and for economic survival. A widower with a farm needed a wife to help run the household. A widow with young children needed a husband for protection and financial support. This led to the formation of what we would now call stepfamilies on a massive scale. A child might lose both parents, be taken in by an aunt, who then remarries a widower who already has children of his own. The traditional, stable, multi-generational family unit was replaced by a more fluid and fragile structure, held together by the shared experience of loss and the practical need for survival. This restructuring of the family also subtly changed the experience of childhood. Before the plague, children in peasant and artisan families were seen as miniature adults. They were expected to start working from a very young age and contribute to the family economy. But in the post-plague world, with so many children having died, the surviving children became more precious. There was a new emotional investment in childhood. At the same time, the chaos and high mortality rates forced children to become self-reliant much earlier. A 10-year-old orphan could not afford a long childhood. They had to find a way to support themselves. This created a dual reality for children. They were both more cherished and more burdened, living in a world that saw them as both a precious future and a necessary, immediate source of labor. Let's trace the story of a wealthy survivor, a silk merchant from Florence named Giovanni. As soon as the plague began to spread in his city, he did what many of the rich did. He gathered his immediate family, packed his most valuable possessions, and fled to a remote country villa. He barricaded his family inside, allowing no one to enter or leave. For months, they lived in isolated luxury, eating from their stored food supplies, while the city they had left behind was consumed by the pestilence. Giovanni survived, as did his wife and children. He saw his decision as a prudent and responsible act, the duty of a father to protect his family. He believed he had outsmarted death through his wealth and foresight, but his survival came at a price he had not anticipated. When the plague finally subsided and Giovanni returned to Florence, he found a city of ghosts. His extended family, his brothers, his cousins, his uncles, were all dead. His business partners were gone. Most of his skilled weavers had perished. But the most shocking discovery was the reaction of the other survivors. They did not welcome him back as a leader. They shunned him. They called him a coward, a man who had abandoned his city and his responsibilities in its darkest hour. The other merchants who had stayed, who had risked their lives and lost their families but had kept the city's commerce from collapsing entirely, now held the positions of power. Giovanni's wealth could not buy back his honor. He was a survivor, but he was also an outcast, a lonely figure in a city that now belonged to a new, grimmer, and tougher class of men. The story of Giovanni illustrates a key social dynamic of the post-plague world. The old hierarchies, based on inherited wealth and established family names, were severely weakened. A new, more meritocratic, and often more ruthless, order was emerging. A person's worth was judged not just by their money, but by their actions during the crisis. Did they stay and help, or did they run and hide? This created new social tensions and resentments that would simmer for years. The plague had been a crucible, and it had forged a new kind of society, one where survival, resilience, and a certain degree of ruthlessness were the most valuable currencies. The comfortable, ordered world of the old elite was gone forever, replaced by a more volatile and unpredictable social landscape. One of the most profound and lasting consequences of the Black Death was its effect on language. Before the plague, Latin was the universal language of power, religion, and intellect in Europe. All official government documents, all church services, and all university lectures were conducted in Latin. It was the language of a small, educated elite, but the plague disproportionately killed this elite. The thousands of priests, monks, clerks, and scholars who died were the very people who kept the Latin language alive. Their sudden disappearance created a vacuum. There were not enough Latin speakers left to run the bureaucracy of the church and state. To keep the wheels of society turning, they had to switch to the language of the common people, the vernacular. This shift was revolutionary. Suddenly, official court records in England began to be kept in English. Royal decrees in France were written in French. Great literature began to be written in the language that people actually spoke. Geoffrey Chaucer in England wrote the Canterbury Tales. Giovanni Boccaccio in Italy wrote the Decameron. These were not just great works of art. They were a declaration of cultural independence. They proved that the vernacular languages were just as capable of expressing complex ideas and beautiful poetry as Latin was. This linguistic shift was a huge step towards the formation of national identities. People began to see themselves not just as Christians in a universal Christendom, but as Englishmen, Frenchmen, or Italians, united by a common language and culture. The Black Death, by killing the guardians of the old universal language, accidentally became the midwife of the modern European nations. A similar revolution was happening in the world of medicine. For centuries, medicine had been dominated by university-trained physicians. These were men who had studied the ancient Greek and Roman medical texts, particularly the works of Galen. Their approach was highly theoretical and based on the philosophy of the four humors. They rarely touched their patients, considering that sort of thing to be beneath them. Practical procedures, like surgery or bloodletting, were left to a lower class of practitioners, the barber surgeons, but the plague exposed the complete failure of this theoretical approach. The learned physicians, with all their ancient texts and complex theories, were utterly powerless. Their remedies were useless, and they died at the same rate as everyone else. This catastrophic failure led to a slow but profound crisis of confidence in the old medical establishment. In the aftermath, the more practical, hands-on approach of the surgeons began to gain more respect. Since they were the ones who actually cut open bodies, they had a much better, albeit still limited, understanding of human anatomy. The new emphasis on understanding the body led to a rise in human dissection at medical schools, a practice that had been rare and controversial. Doctors began to realize that if they wanted to understand disease, they couldn't just read about it in an ancient book. They had to look at the body itself. This was the beginning of a shift away from a medicine based on ancient authority and towards a medicine based on direct observation and empirical evidence. The painful birth of modern, scientific medicine lies in the ashes of the plague. The religious response to the plague was not just about fear and punishment, it was also about finding new sources of comfort and protection. With the official church seeming so powerless, people turned to a more personal and direct form of faith. This was expressed in the massive popularity of certain saints, who were believed to have special power against the pestilence. The most important of these were Saint Roche and Saint Sebastian. Saint Sebastian was an early Christian martyr who was sentenced to be executed by a volley of arrows. He survived, and because his arrow wounds resembled the dark spots or buboes of the plague, he was seen as a protector against the disease. People believed that if he could survive being pierced by arrows, he could help them survive being pierced by the invisible arrows of the pestilence. Saint Roche was an even more direct plague saint. According to his legend, he was a pilgrim in the 14th century who went to Italy and miraculously cured many plague victims simply by making the sign of the cross over them. Eventually, he contracted the disease himself. He developed a bubo on his thigh and went into the forest to die alone, but he was saved by a dog that brought him bread every day and licked his wounds until they healed. This story made him an incredibly popular and relatable figure. He was not a distant martyr from the ancient past. He was someone who had suffered from the exact same disease and had survived. People prayed to him with a special fervor, and images of him, pointing to the plague sore on his thigh, with his faithful dog at his side, became one of the most common forms of religious art in the late Middle Ages. As the decades passed and the plague returned again and again, society began to adapt. The initial shock and chaos gave way to a more organized and systematic response. The quarantine, pioneered in Italian port cities, became a standard practice across Europe. Cities established permanent boards of health, committees with the power to enforce public health measures. They hired their own doctors, established pest houses, and organized teams for burying the dead. The response to the plague became institutionalized. It was no longer a panicked, ad hoc reaction. It was a planned, bureaucratic procedure. Life became punctuated by these periods of lockdown and quarantine. People learned to live with the constant threat, incorporating it into the rhythm of their lives. The plague had become a grim but manageable fact of existence. Let's imagine a child born in a city like London or Paris around the year 1400. We'll call her Eleanor. The first devastating wave of the Black Death happened 2 generations before she was born. But the plague is still very much a part of her world. She has grown up with the stories of the Great Mortality, tales told by her grandparents that sound like myths of an apocalyptic past. But for Eleanor, the plague is also a present reality. She has lived through 2 smaller outbreaks in her short life. She knows the routine. She knows what it means when the church bells start to ring at an unusual hour. She knows the sight of the red cross painted on a neighbor's door and the smell of the special herbs that her mother burns in the house to, quote, cleanse the air. For Eleanor, the rules of quarantine are as normal as the rules of a game. She knows that when the plague is in the city, she is not allowed to play in the street with her friends. She knows that her father has to get a special certificate of health from the city officials to be able to go to the market. She has seen the sad little processions of the plague carts from her window. This is the only world she has ever known, a world where life is punctuated by periods of intense fear and isolation. The trauma of the Black Death has become embedded in the culture, passed down from one generation to the next, not just as a story, but as a set of rituals and procedures for survival. She is a child of the plague era, and her worldview is shaped by the knowledge that life is fragile and that death can arrive, silently and invisibly, at any time. The recurring nature of the plague also led to the creation of the first systems of data collection. The boards of health in cities like Milan and Florence began to keep detailed records during outbreaks. They were called bills of mortality. Officials would go from house to house, counting the dead and trying to record the cause of death. These were not just simple lists of names. They were the world's first public health statistics. Authorities used this data to track the spread of the disease through the city, to see which neighborhoods were hit the hardest, and to try and predict how long the outbreak would last. This was a revolutionary idea, the belief that a disease could be understood and controlled not just through prayer, but through the systematic collection and analysis of information. It was the birth of the science of epidemiology. The economic landscape continued to be defined by the labor shortage for a century or more. This had some very strange consequences. For example, there was a sudden boom in the construction of colleges at universities like Oxford and Cambridge. Why? Because a huge amount of land had been left to the church by people who died without heirs. But the church, like everyone else, didn't have enough people to farm this land. So they leased it out for very long terms at low rents. This created a new source of stable long-term income, and this money was often used to found new educational institutions. It is another of the plague's great ironies. The mass death of the uneducated peasantry indirectly funded a massive expansion in higher education for the elite. Let's consider the popular entertainment of the time. The plague's influence was felt even here. A new kind of play became very popular in the 15th century, the morality play. These were allegorical dramas where the main character, who represented mankind or everyman, would be visited by characters representing different virtues and vices, like charity, greed, or pride. The central conflict of the play was the struggle for the soul of mankind, and very often, the final character to appear on stage would be death. These plays were a public and theatrical way of processing the anxieties that the plague had made so real. They were a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of being prepared for a sudden and unexpected death. They were a form of public service announcement wrapped in the guise of entertainment. The constant fear of the plague also fueled a darker side of human nature, a fascination with the macabre and the grotesque. The art of the late Middle Ages is full of images of decomposing bodies, of skeletons, and of the torments of hell. This was not just about religious warning. It was a reflection of the world people saw around them. They were surrounded by death in its most gruesome forms. This art was a way of externalizing their fears, of giving a face to the horror that they lived with every day. By depicting death in all its grim detail, they were trying to master their fear of it, to look it directly in the eye. It was a dark and often disturbing art form, but it was also an honest one, a true reflection of the psychological state of a deeply traumatized society. Let's revisit the plague doctor and his iconic costume. While the full beaked mask costume became more common in the 17th century, the principles behind it were developing throughout the plague era. The core idea was that of a barrier. The doctor was trying to create an impermeable shield between himself and the disease. The waxed cloak, the leather gloves, the mask, they were all part of an attempt to seal himself off from a contaminated world. This concept of a barrier, of creating a clean, protected space, was a crucial step in the development of modern medical hygiene. While their understanding of the disease was wrong, they were fighting bad air, not germs. Their instinct to create a protective barrier between the caregiver and the patient was exactly right. It was a good idea, born from a completely wrong theory. The plague also had a profound, if subtle, impact on the relationship between humans and the natural world. In the pre-plague era, with its rising population, humanity was in a constant battle with nature, clearing forests for farmland, draining swamps. But after the plague, the pressure was off. Nature came flooding back. Forests regrew, and wild animals returned to lands that had been farmed for centuries. For the first time in a long time, the European landscape became wilder. This may have fostered a new appreciation for the beauty and power of the natural world. The landscape painters of the Renaissance, with their detailed and loving depictions of nature, were painting a world that had been reshaped by the plague, a world where the hand of man had been forced to retreat and the wilderness had returned. The legal concept of force majeure, or an act of God, became much more important after the plague. This is the idea that a contract can be broken without penalty if an unforeseeable and uncontrollable event, like a natural disaster, makes it impossible to fulfill. The plague was the ultimate act of God. A merchant might have a contract to deliver a cargo of wool, but if the plague killed all his sailors and shut down the port, he could not be held responsible. The plague forced the legal system to become more flexible, to acknowledge that there were forces in the world that were beyond human control. This was a major step in the development of modern contract law, a legal innovation born from the need to make sense of a world in chaos. Let's consider the soundscape again. The unnatural silence of the cities during the plague was one thing, but the recurring outbreaks created a new set of sounds that became signals of fear. The primary one was the tolling of the church bell for a funeral. In normal times, this was a common sound, but during a plague outbreak, the bells rang constantly. Some cities passed laws forbidding the ringing of funeral bells during a pestilence, because the constant, mournful sound was causing widespread panic and despair. The absence of the bell then became its own kind of terrifying silence. People would listen intently, trying to gauge the severity of the outbreak by the number of funeral processions they could hear passing in the street, a silent calculus of death. The sheer number of deaths among the clergy led to some strange and desperate measures by the church. In some places, the Pope granted special dispensations to allow lay people, and even women, to hear the confessions of the dying if no priest was available. This was a radical break with centuries of church doctrine, which held that only an ordained priest could forgive sins. It was a temporary emergency measure, but the idea that an ordinary person could perform one of the most sacred functions of the priesthood was a powerful one. It was another small crack in the monolithic authority of the church, a hint that the relationship between God and the individual might be more direct than the official doctrine allowed. The plague also triggered one of the first great waves of medical misinformation. With the official doctor so powerless, the field was wide open for quacks and charlatans to sell their own miracle cures. They sold magical amulets, useless potions, and nonsensical advice. One common piece of advice was to avoid bathing, as it was believed that washing would open the pores of the skin and let the evil miasma in. This, of course, only made the problems of sanitation and flea infestation worse. This explosion of bad information, of desperate people clinging to false hopes, is not just a feature of medieval plagues. It is a recurring feature of every pandemic in human history, a shadow that walks alongside the disease itself. Let's look at the financial markets. The plague caused one of the first great inflationary shocks in European history. In the immediate aftermath, with so few people and so much inherited money, the price of goods soared. But the most dramatic effect was on the price of labor. Wages for skilled and unskilled workers doubled or even tripled in a few short years. The ruling classes were horrified. They saw their wealth draining away into the pockets of the peasantry. They passed laws, like the Statute of Laborers in England, that made it illegal to demand or to pay wages higher than the pre-plague levels. These laws were almost impossible to enforce and led to massive social unrest, including the peasants' revolt. The plague had not just killed people, it had broken the old economic order. The psychological need to find meaning in the suffering was immense. For many, this meaning was found in the idea of the plague as a cleansing fire. It was seen as God's way of scourging a sinful world, of burning away the corruption and leaving behind a purer, more devout society. This belief could be comforting. It gave a purpose to the horror. It meant that the deaths of loved ones were not random, but part of a divine plan. Many survivors dedicated their lives to piety, founding new chapels, joining religious orders, or going on long pilgrimages. They saw themselves as the chosen few, the righteous remnant, who had been spared to build a new and better world on the ashes of the old. It was a way of transforming their trauma into a sacred mission. Let's look at the city of Milan. Milan was one of the few major Italian cities to be largely spared during the first wave of the Black Death. Their success was attributed to the ruthless and tyrannical efficiency of their rulers. When the plague first appeared in the city, the authorities immediately walled up the houses where the infection was found, sealing everyone inside, the sick and the healthy, to die together. It was an act of brutal, cold-hearted public health policy. They sacrificed a few hundred of their citizens to save the rest of the city. Milan's story became a stark and disturbing lesson for the rest of Europe. In the face of a pandemic, extreme and tyrannical measures, while horrifying, could be effective. It was a dangerous lesson that would echo through the history of public health for centuries. The plague's impact on personal hygiene was paradoxical. On one hand, the fear of miasma led to the closure of public bathhouses, which were seen as places where evil vapors could congregate. This contributed to a decline in personal cleanliness among the general population. On the other hand, among the medical and civic authorities, a new understanding of contagion was slowly emerging. It wasn't a germ theory yet, but there was a growing recognition that the disease could be transmitted through contact with the sick or their belongings. This led to new practices, like disinfecting the homes of plague victims by washing them with vinegar and fumigating them with the smoke of burning sulfur. It was a slow, stumbling progress towards a cleaner, more sanitary world, driven by the terror of the pestilence. Consider the experience of a medieval Jew who survived not only the plague but also the horrific massacres that accompanied it. Their trauma would have been twofold. They would have endured the same grief and loss as their Christian neighbors, watching their families and friends die from the disease. But they would also have endured the terror of being hunted by their neighbors, of being falsely accused of causing the very suffering that they were also experiencing. A survivor of such an ordeal would be left with a profound sense of alienation and a deep understanding of the fragility of social trust. Their story is a crucial part of the history of the Black Death, a reminder that in times of crisis, the fear of the disease is often compounded by the even greater danger of human hatred and violence. The Black Death also changed the very tools people worked with. With a shortage of skilled artisans, there was a new emphasis on quality and durability. A peasant who could suddenly afford to buy a new scythe or a new cooking pot would want to make sure it lasted. This led to a gradual improvement in the quality of everyday objects. Guilds tightened their standards, and the overall level of craftsmanship in many fields improved. It is another of the strange, counterintuitive consequences of the plague. The world of objects became more robust and well-made, even as the world of people had become so fragile and transient. People clung to well-made, durable possessions as a small form of security in a deeply insecure world. Let's imagine a conversation between a grandfather and his grandson in the year 1400. The grandfather is a survivor of the first wave. The grandson has only known the world that came after. The grandfather would speak of the time before, a world that would seem mythical to the boy, a world crowded with people, where you had to bow to the lord of the manor and work for almost nothing. He would speak of the great mortality as a time of darkness and terror, but also as a great hinge of history, the moment that changed everything. For the grandson, the high wages, the abundant land, the freedom to move to a different village, these are all normal. He cannot truly comprehend the world his grandfather lost, or the price that was paid for the world he inherited. This generation gap was one of the most profound in human history. The plague left behind a world that was full of empty spaces. Not just the abandoned villages, but empty rooms and houses, empty stalls in the marketplace, empty pews in the church. This emptiness was a physical presence, a constant reminder of the dead. People would have had to learn to live with these voids. A family might continue to live in a house where half the rooms were now empty, silent memorials to the children or siblings who once lived there. This experience of living in a world that was too big for its population would have created a unique psychological atmosphere, a sense of being small figures in a vast, empty landscape, a feeling that would be reflected in the art and literature of the period. The sheer volume of death also created a crisis of burial space. Churchyards in the cities, which had been used for centuries, were filled to capacity in a matter of months. This forced the creation of new, large cemeteries outside the city walls. These were the first planned municipal cemeteries in Europe. Unlike the old churchyards, they were not attached to a specific parish. They were civic spaces, designed to handle death on an industrial scale. This was the beginning of the separation of the dead from the world of the living, a process that would continue for centuries. The dead were no longer just under the church floor or outside the window. They were being moved to their own separate city on the edge of town. Let's consider the impact on the food supply in the long term. The shift from labor-intensive grain farming to less intensive animal husbandry had a permanent effect on the European diet and landscape. More land was given over to grazing, which meant more meat and dairy products were available. It also led to the enclosure of common lands, as lords fenced off fields for their sheep, a process that would have major social consequences in the centuries to come. The European diet and the very look of the countryside were fundamentally and permanently altered. The next time you see a field of grazing sheep in the English countryside, you are looking at a living monument to the Black Death. The psychological shock of the plague led to an increased interest in personal salvation. People became obsessed with the fate of their soul after death. This fueled a massive boom in the sale of indulgences. An indulgence was a certificate sold by the church that was supposed to reduce the amount of time a soul would have to spend in purgatory. In the post-plague world, people were desperate for any spiritual security they could get, and they were willing to pay for it. This practice became a huge source of revenue for the church, but it also became a source of great corruption and resentment. The widespread anger over the sale of indulgences would be one of the main sparks that ignited Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation a century later. The brutal truth of the Black Death is that it never truly ended. It simply faded. The outbreaks became less frequent and less severe over the course of the next 3 centuries. There were several reasons for this. The human population gradually developed more genetic resistance. Public health measures, like quarantines, became more effective. There may also have been a change in the rats themselves. The black rat, which lives in close proximity to humans, was gradually displaced in Europe by the brown rat, which tends to live more separately in sewers and burrows. This may have helped to break the chain of transmission, but the fear of the plague, the great mortality, lingered in the collective memory long after the disease itself had ceased to be a major threat. Let's look at one of the last major outbreaks, the Great Plague of London in 1665. The world was very different from the world of 1348. There were printing presses, more advanced science, and a more organized government. But the experience was hauntingly similar. We have detailed accounts from writers like Samuel Pepys, who described the same eerie silence, the same red crosses on the doors, the same desperate flight of the wealthy, and the same heroic efforts of the poor who were left behind. It showed that despite 300 years of progress, humanity was still incredibly vulnerable to this ancient enemy. The Great Fire of London the following year, which burned down the crowded medieval parts of the city, is often credited with ending the plague for good in England. The legacy of the Black Death is complex. It was an unimaginable tragedy, a period of horror and suffering that is difficult to comprehend. It caused the deaths of tens of millions of people and shattered a civilization. But it was also a powerful agent of change. It accelerated the end of the feudal system, fueled the rise of a new merchant class, spurred technological innovation, and paved the way for the intellectual and cultural revolutions of the Renaissance and the Reformation. It is a terrifying example of how a destructive event can also be a creative one, how the death of an old world can, in a painful and brutal way, create the conditions for the birth of a new one. When we think about the Black Death, we often picture a distant, almost mythical event from the Dark Ages. But the bacterium that caused it, Yersinia pestis, still exists. Plague is still found today in rodent populations in various parts of the world, including the Western United States. Modern medicine, specifically antibiotics, has made it easily treatable. We are no longer helpless against it. But its continued existence is a humbling reminder that the invisible world of microbes that so terrified our ancestors is still with us. We have built powerful defenses against it, but we have not eliminated it. The story of the Black Death is not just a history lesson, it's a permanent cautionary tale. The plague forced humanity to confront its own mortality on a scale never seen before. It stripped away the comforting illusions of order and stability and revealed the raw, fragile nature of human existence. For the survivors, the world was no longer a predictable stage for a divine drama. It was a chaotic and dangerous place where life could be extinguished in an instant for no apparent reason. This new, darker understanding of the world was a heavy burden, but it also contained a seed of liberation. By confronting the worst that life could throw at them, the survivors gained a new appreciation for life itself, a fierce, desperate desire to find meaning, beauty, and joy in a world that had shown them so much ugliness. Let's end our journey by returning to a single human being, a woman living in a small French village in the late 14th century. We will call her Isabelle. She survived the first plague as a young child. She remembers it only as a confusing time of fear, of her mother crying, of the church bells ringing constantly. She is now a grandmother. She has lived through two more, smaller outbreaks. She has buried a husband and two of her 5 children. The plague is not a historical event for her. It is the defining rhythm of her life, the constant, low drumbeat of fear that has sounded beneath everything she has ever done. It is the reason she has more land than her parents did, the reason she can afford to eat meat twice a week, and the reason she clutches her grandchildren a little tighter whenever they have a fever. Isabelle's life is a testament to human resilience. She has endured a level of loss that would shatter most of us. But she has not been shattered. She has rebuilt her family, worked her land, and found moments of joy and laughter in a world steeped in grief. She is not a hero of a grand story. She is an ordinary person who has managed to survive in an extraordinary time. Her story, and the stories of the millions like her, is the real story of the Black Death. It is not about kings or popes or battles. It is about the quiet, stubborn, and often desperate determination of ordinary people to continue living, to continue loving, and to continue hoping in the face of absolute despair. The brutal truth of the Black Death is not just the number of the dead. It is the weight carried by the living. It is the memory of the abandoned, the guilt of the survivor, the fear of the parent, and the loneliness of the orphan. It is a story written in the scars on a person's skin and in the deeper, invisible scars on their soul. It is a story of a world where the most basic human connections were tested and often broken, where the boundary between civilization and chaos was revealed to be terrifyingly thin. It is a story that reminds us of how fragile our own world is, how quickly the systems we rely on can collapse, and how much we depend on the simple, often unseen bonds of trust and compassion that hold our societies together. As we pull back from this dark and distant time, it is easy to see the people of the 14th century as superstitious and ignorant, fighting a disease with prayers and perfume. But their reactions were profoundly human. They sought explanations, they looked for someone to blame, they turned to their faith, they despaired, and they hoped. They did exactly what we would do, with the limited knowledge and tools that they had. Their story is our story, written on a larger and more terrible scale. It is a story of a species confronting a threat that it does not understand and cannot control, and somehow, against all odds, finding a way to endure. The world after the Black Death was a quieter, emptier, and sadder place. But it was also a world of new possibilities. The rigid structures of the old world had been broken, and for those who survived, there was a new and often frightening freedom. The story of the Black Death is ultimately a dual one. It is a story of an ending and a beginning, of a great death and a painful rebirth. It is the story of how a tiny, invisible organism brought a continent to its knees, and in doing so, cleared the way for the creation of the world we now inhabit. The shadows of this great mortality are longer and reach farther than we could ever imagine. This new world, born from the plague, was one where the relationship with death itself had fundamentally changed. Before the great mortality, death was a familiar communal event. A person died in their own bed, surrounded by family, with the priest administering the last rites. It was a sad but orderly part of life. The plague destroyed that order. Death became sudden, anonymous, and horrifyingly industrial. The image of the communal plague pit, where hundreds of naked bodies were unceremoniously dumped and covered with a thin layer of earth, became the new, defining image of mortality. This shift from the personal deathbed to the anonymous mass grave was a psychological shock that stripped death of its dignity and its sacredness, leaving behind only a raw, biological horror. In the wake of this, people became obsessed with ensuring they would not be forgotten. The wealthy survivors poured their newfound fortunes into personal memorials. This was the golden age of the chantry chapel. A chantry was a private chapel, often built as an addition to a larger church, where a priest was hired to do one thing and one thing only: say Mass for the soul of the founder forever. It was a form of spiritual insurance, a way to ensure that even if you died a bad death during the next outbreak, a professional would be praying for your soul, helping you through purgatory. These chapels, many of which still exist, are monuments to the deep spiritual anxiety and the survivors' guilt of the post-plague elite. They were trying to buy their way into a heaven they felt they might not deserve. For the common people, who could not afford a private priest, this anxiety was expressed in different ways. There was a huge increase in the popularity of religious guilds and fraternities. These were social clubs, but with a spiritual purpose. Members would pay a small annual fee, and in return, the guild would guarantee them a proper, dignified funeral. They would provide a coffin, a burial shroud, and a procession of guild members to accompany the body to the grave. Most importantly, they would pay for priests to say masses for the member's soul. It was a collective form of the chantry chapel, a way for ordinary people to pool their resources to ensure that they would not be forgotten, that they would not end up in a nameless plague pit. It was a community reforming around the shared fear of an anonymous death. The landscape of Europe is still dotted with the physical scars of the plague if you know where to look. Besides the lost villages, there are the plague stones, or plague crosses. These were often boundary markers set up on the roads outside a town during an outbreak. They marked the edge of the quarantine zone. People from the surrounding countryside would leave food and supplies at the stone, and the townspeople would leave money in a small, hollowed-out basin filled with vinegar, which they hoped would disinfect it. These simple, weathered stones, standing alone in a field or by a roadside, are quiet, powerful memorials. They are not monuments to kings or battles, but to the desperate, everyday struggle for survival and to the fragile acts of trust that allowed communities to endure even when they could not touch. The plague also left its mark on folklore and ghost stories. Many local legends across Europe tell of phantom funeral processions, of spectral carts carrying the dead, or of a ghostly figure in a dark cloak who stalks the roads during a time of sickness. These stories were a way of keeping the memory of the trauma alive, of transforming a historical event into a mythic one. They were cautionary tales, told to children for centuries, a way of passing down the collective wisdom of survival. The stories served as a warning. The pestilence may be gone for now, but its spirit, its ghostly presence, still lingers in the landscape, a reminder of the fragility of life. Let's consider the long-term impact on governance and the power of the state. Before the plague, the power of a king or a city council was relatively limited, but the need to manage the recurring plague outbreaks led to a massive expansion of state power. The boards of health that were established in the 15th century were some of the most powerful government bodies that had ever existed. They had the authority to restrict travel, to seize property, to force people into quarantine, and to control almost every aspect of public life. People accepted this huge loss of personal liberty because the alternative was annihilation. This was the beginning of the modern concept of the state's responsibility for public health, and the idea that, in a crisis, the needs of the collective good could override the rights of the individual. This increase in state power was not always used benevolently. The systems of surveillance and control that were developed to manage the plague could also be used for political purposes. The health certificates that were required for travel could be denied to political undesirables. The quarantine laws could be used to isolate and control troublesome neighborhoods. The plague provided the perfect justification for governments to increase their control over their populations, and these new powers, once gained, were rarely given up. The tools of public health and the tools of political oppression have often been uncomfortably close, a lesson that was first learned in the plague-stricken cities of the late Middle Ages. The plague also triggered a long and slow revolution in domestic architecture. The typical medieval peasant's house was a 1- or 2-room structure made of timber, wattle, and daub, with a thatched roof and a dirt floor. It was dark, poorly ventilated, and often shared with animals. It was also a perfect home for the black rat. In the centuries after the plague, as survivors became wealthier and more concerned with hygiene, the nature of the family home began to change. People started to build with stone and brick. They added more windows for light and air. They separated the living quarters from the places where animals were kept. These changes were not just about comfort. They were a form of preventative medicine. A cleaner, brighter, and more solid house was a healthier house, less welcoming to the rats and fleas that were, still unknowingly, the carriers of the disease. Let's look at the medical profession one last time. While the university-trained physicians had been largely discredited, the plague era did see the rise of a new kind of medical hero, the empirical observer. These were doctors and sometimes laypeople who decided to abandon the ancient texts and simply watch the disease very carefully. They kept detailed notes on the symptoms, on who got sick and who didn't, and on which treatments seemed to have any effect, however small. They were conducting the first, primitive forms of clinical observation. They did not discover the cure for the plague, but they did lay the groundwork for a new, more scientific approach to medicine, one based on evidence and experience rather than on received authority. The seeds of the scientific method were sown in the desperate attempt to make sense of the pestilence. The art of the danse macabre, or dance of death, which was so raw and immediate in the aftermath of the first wave, slowly changed over the next century. It became more stylized, more elaborate, and in a strange way, less terrifying. The early images were a stark and democratic reminder that everyone dies. But by the late 15th century, the dance of death had become a more theatrical and moralizing spectacle. It was less about the biological reality of death and more about the spiritual need to be prepared for it. This evolution shows how a society processes a great trauma. The initial raw horror is slowly contained, organized, and transformed into a familiar cultural symbol, a scary story with a clear moral, a way of taming the memory of something that was once unbearably wild. Let's talk about the children of the new rich. Imagine being the son of a man like Filippo, our fictional Florentine merchant who built a fortune from the ruins of the plague. You have grown up in a magnificent house, surrounded by luxury. But your father is a hard, haunted man who speaks often of the time when he was poor and his entire family was wiped out. He pushes you relentlessly to be successful, to be ruthless, to never take your good fortune for granted. There is a deep anxiety that runs beneath the surface of all this new wealth, a fear that it could all be taken away in an instant. The second generation of the post-plague elite inherited their parents' money, but they also inherited their trauma, a deep-seated insecurity that would fuel the frantic ambition and the conspicuous consumption of the early Renaissance. The plague also created a permanent class of new poor. These were the people who had lost everything: their families, their land, their trade. They drifted to the cities, forming a growing urban underclass with no work and no social safety net. This led to a rise in crime and social unrest, but it also led to the creation of the first organized systems of public charity. Cities began to establish municipal poorhouses and food distribution programs, not out of pure compassion, but out of a pragmatic need to maintain social order. The plague, by creating such a visible and desperate class of poor people, forced society to acknowledge poverty not just as an individual misfortune, but as a social problem that required a collective, institutional response. Consider the impact on the concept of time. In the pre-plague world, the most important timepiece was the church bell, which divided the day into periods for prayer. But the new, more commercial world that emerged after the plague required a more precise way of measuring time. Merchants needed to know the exact hour to meet a business partner. Lawyers needed to track the time they spent on a case. This led to the development and widespread adoption of the mechanical clock. The first public clocks, installed in the towers of town halls, became symbols of civic pride in the new, more secular rhythm of urban life. The shift from the church bell to the town clock was a subtle but profound one, a sign that the world was becoming less governed by the time of God and more governed by the time of man and his business. Let's explore the lingering xenophobia more deeply. The violent persecution of the Jewish population during the first wave was a dark stain on the soul of Europe, but the instinct to blame an outsider for the disease did not go away. In later outbreaks, the blame was often shifted to other targets. In one city, it might be prostitutes. In another, it might be foreign travelers or migrant workers. The plague provided a perfect excuse for societies to persecute their existing scapegoats. It amplified pre-existing prejudices and gave them a deadly new justification. The fear of the disease became entangled with the fear of the other, creating a toxic brew of hatred and suspicion that would poison European society for centuries to come. The plague created a crisis in the system of apprenticeships, which was the primary way that skills were passed down from one generation to the next. A master craftsman would take on a young boy as an apprentice for 7 years, teaching him the trade in exchange for his labor. But the plague killed thousands of masters, leaving their apprentices with no one to complete their training. It also killed thousands of apprentices. The guilds were forced to relax their standards, to shorten the term of apprenticeship, and to allow masters to take on more apprentices than before. This led to a dilution of skills in some areas, but it also made the trades more accessible to a wider range of people, contributing to the social mobility of the era. The psychological impact on the survivors included a deep and lasting cynicism towards authority. They had seen the best doctors in Europe prove to be completely useless. They had seen the Pope and the bishops unable to stop the pestilence with their prayers. They had seen kings and nobles abandon their people and flee to safety. The institutions that were supposed to be the pillars of society had been revealed as hollow and powerless in the face of a real crisis. This bred a healthy skepticism, a new willingness to question and to challenge authority, whether it was medical, religious, or political. This critical spirit was a necessary precondition for the great intellectual and religious upheavals that were to come. Imagine a bookseller's shop around the year 1470, after the invention of the printing press. The plague is still a recent memory, returning every decade or so. Among the religious texts in classical philosophy, you would find a new kind of bestseller, the plague pamphlet. These were short, cheap, printed booklets that offered advice on how to survive the next outbreak. They were full of herbal remedies, prayers to the plague saints, and instructions on how to make your own pomanders and fumigating smokes. They were the self-help books of their day, a sign that people were no longer passively waiting for the authorities to save them. They were actively seeking out information, trying to arm themselves with whatever knowledge, real or imagined, they could find to protect their families. The sheer amount of vacant property in the cities after the plague led to one of the first great urban renewal projects in history. Municipal governments would seize abandoned, derelict properties and sell them cheaply to developers, with the condition that they build new, better houses. This was a way to repopulate the empty parts of the city and to improve the overall quality of the housing stock. It led to the clearing of many of the old, crowded, unsanitary medieval slums and their replacement with the more orderly and spacious streets and squares that we associate with the Renaissance city. The modern city, with its emphasis on planning and public space, was born from the empty lots left behind by the plague. Let's think about the color black. In the medieval period, black was not necessarily the primary color of mourning, but the Black Death, with its name and its dark associations, helped to cement black as the color of death and grief in the Western imagination. The wealthy survivors, who could afford expensive dyes, began to wear black as a sign of their perpetual mourning for their lost families. It was a form of conspicuous grief, a way of displaying both their piety and their social status. This fashion, born from the trauma of the plague, has endured for centuries, a subtle but powerful reminder of the time when death cast a black shadow over the entire continent. The recurring nature of the plague created a society that was, in a strange way, more resilient. People learned to live with a level of uncertainty and risk that would be unimaginable to us. They knew that their lives could be upended at any moment. This did not necessarily make them braver, but it did make them more pragmatic. They learned to be adaptable, to seize opportunities when they arose, and to rebuild after a catastrophe. The generations that grew up in the plague era were, by necessity, survivors. They were shaped by a harsh and unforgiving world, and this made them tough, resourceful, and fiercely determined to live. This resilience was perhaps the most important legacy that the survivors of the Black Death passed on to the future. The brutal truth about living through the Black Death was not a single, continuous horror, but a series of terrifying episodes against a backdrop of uneasy quiet. Life was a lottery. You could survive one outbreak completely untouched, only to lose your entire family in the next. This randomness was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of all. It defied all attempts to find a rational or moral order in the world. The pious died, the sinful survived. The careful died, the reckless survived. This arbitrary nature of death and survival left a deep scar on the collective psyche, a permanent sense of the world's fundamental injustice and unpredictability. It was a heavy philosophical burden for a society built on the idea of a just and orderly cosmos. The long-term environmental consequences were vast. The reforestation of Europe was one aspect, but the reduction in human and animal populations also had other effects. Rivers that had been polluted by industrial processes like tanning and cloth dyeing began to run clean again. The air in the cities, thick with wood smoke, cleared. For a brief period, the natural world was allowed to recover from the pressures of a large human population. Some historians have even called the post-plague era a, quote, golden age for European megafauna, as animals like wolves and bears, which had been hunted to the brink of extinction, found their territories expanding again into the newly wild lands. It was a grim and accidental rewilding of a continent. Let's talk about the end of the plague in Europe. It wasn't a single event, but a long, slow fade over more than 300 years. The Great Plague of London in 1665 was one of the last major urban outbreaks. The last significant epidemic on the continent was in Marseille, France in 1720. Why did it finally go away? There is no single answer. It was a combination of factors. The quarantines and public health measures, honed over centuries of practice, had become much more effective at containing outbreaks before they could become pandemics. The gradual replacement of the black rat with the brown rat, which is a less efficient carrier of the disease, played a crucial role. Changes in human society were also key. The improvements in housing, with more buildings made of brick and stone, made it harder for rats to coexist with people. Better sanitation and waste disposal in the cities reduced the overall rat population. And finally, there may have been changes in the bacterium itself. It's possible that over time, a less virulent strain of Yersinia pestis became dominant, one that was less likely to cause the deadly pneumonic or septicemic forms of the disease. It was not a single silver bullet that ended the plague era, but a slow, complex dance of coevolution between a microbe, its hosts, and the changing human society that it preyed upon. The memory of the plague became a powerful political tool. For centuries afterwards, rulers and governments would invoke the memory of the Great Mortality to justify their actions. They would use the threat of a new pestilence to enforce unpopular public health laws, to raise taxes for sanitation projects, or to restrict the movement of their populations. The plague became a bogeyman, a convenient and terrifying justification for the expansion of state power. The trauma of the 14th century gave the governments of the 17th and 18th centuries a powerful lever to control their citizens, a legacy of fear that was almost as enduring as the disease itself. Consider the role of the will to live. Amidst all the death and despair, what kept the survivors going? For some, it was faith. For others, it was the responsibility to care for their surviving children. And for many, it was simply a stubborn, animal instinct for survival. The accounts of the plague are full of stories of people who, after losing everything, simply got up the next day and started again. They remarried, they had more children, they replanted their fields. This sheer, dogged refusal to give up is perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire story. It is a testament to the profound and often irrational human drive to continue, to build, and to hope, even in the ruins of a dead world. The Black Death was a humbling event. It was a stark reminder of humanity's place in the natural world. In an age of faith, people saw themselves as the pinnacle of God's creation, fundamentally separate from and superior to the animal world. The plague shattered this illusion. It showed that humans were just as vulnerable as any other creature to the indifferent forces of nature. It was a disease of rats that had spilled over into the human population, a brutal lesson in biology. This dawning awareness of humanity's vulnerability, of our status as just one part of a complex and often dangerous ecosystem, was a terrifying but necessary step towards a more modern, scientific understanding of our place in the world. The sheer loss of life also meant a loss of human capital, of accumulated knowledge and skill. A master stonemason who died took with him 30 years of experience that could not be easily replaced. A skilled weaver took with her a knowledge of patterns and techniques that might be lost forever. A scholar took with him a lifetime of reading and interpretation. The plague was not just a demographic catastrophe, it was an intellectual and cultural one. It created a lost generation on a scale that is hard to imagine, and it took centuries for Europe to recover the depth of skill and knowledge that was lost in those few short years. Let's consider the concept of risk. The plague fundamentally rewired society's attitude towards risk and reward. The old, conservative, feudal world was based on stability and the avoidance of risk. But in the volatile, unpredictable world that the plague created, taking risks was often the only way to survive. A peasant who left his ancestral village to seek higher wages in the city was taking a huge risk. A merchant who invested in a new, unproven trade route was taking a huge risk. This new tolerance for risk, this embrace of uncertainty as a field of opportunity, was the psychological engine of early capitalism and the age of discovery. The modern world, with its dynamic, risk-driven economy, is a distant echo of the gamble that the survivors of the plague were forced to take every day. The emotional landscape of the post-plague world was one of extremes. On one hand, there was a deep and pervasive melancholy, a sense of living in a fallen, diminished world. This is reflected in the mournful poetry and the macabre art of the period. On the other hand, there was a frantic, almost hysterical embrace of life's pleasures. The survivors, keenly aware of how short life could be, were determined to enjoy it while they could. This led to the lavish feasts, the extravagant clothing, and the worldly stories of Boccaccio's Decameron. This strange combination of deep pessimism and vibrant hedonism, of a culture obsessed with both death and earthly pleasure, is the defining psychological signature of the generations that lived in the shadow of the Black Death. Let's re-examine the role of the rat. For centuries, the black rat, Rattus rattus, was seen as the villain of the story. But the truth is more complex. The rat was not the cause of the disease, but just another one of its vectors, and another of its victims. The rats died from the plague in even greater numbers than the humans. The real villain, if there is one, is the microscopic bacterium, Yersinia pestis, and the flea that carries it from one host to another. The rat was simply the unfortunate vehicle that allowed the flea to travel from its natural home in the wild rodent populations of Asia into the crowded, unsuspecting cities of Europe. It was a tragic chain of biological accidents, with the rat as the unwitting and ultimately suicidal accomplice. The plague created a world where grief was a constant and public emotion. In normal times, grief is a private affair, but during the plague, everyone was grieving. The streets were filled with mourners. The sound of weeping was a constant backdrop to city life. This shared, universal experience of loss created a new kind of social bond. Strangers might meet in the street and find a common language in their shared grief for their lost families. This did not necessarily make society kinder, but it did make it more emotionally honest. The stiff upper lip had not yet been invented. The survivors of the plague lived in a world where sorrow was a public utility, a sad and bitter currency that everyone shared. One of the most enduring legacies of the Black Death is the modern hospital system. The pest houses and lazarettos that were established to deal with the plague were the first institutions dedicated to the isolation and treatment of a specific infectious disease. They were run not by the church but by civic authorities. They were staffed by paid doctors and nurses, and they were funded by public taxes. This was a revolutionary model. It was the birth of secular, state-sponsored healthcare. The modern hospital, with its focus on hygiene, quarantine, and public health, is a direct descendant of the desperate measures that were taken to fight a disease that was, at the time, completely incurable. Let's think about the role of information. In 1348, information moved at the speed of a walking man or a sailing ship. Rumors of a terrible pestilence in the East were just vague and terrifying stories. There was no way to verify them, no way to track the spread of the disease, no way to warn people of what was coming. This information vacuum was a key reason why the plague was so devastating. People were caught completely by surprise. The desperate need for reliable information during the recurring outbreaks was a major driver for the development of communication technologies, from a more organized postal service to the printing press itself. The fight against the plague was also a fight against ignorance. The Black Death was, in a sense, a massive, uncontrolled experiment in what happens to a society when you suddenly remove a third of its population. The results were surprising. Some things collapsed, but other things were created. The old, rigid feudal economy collapsed, but a new, more dynamic capitalist economy was born. The universal authority of the church was weakened, but a new, more personal and national form of religious identity began to emerge. The plague was a reset button that no one wanted, but it created a new and unpredictable world. It teaches us that history is not a straight line of progress. It is often a chaotic and violent process, where great leaps forward are born from great tragedies. Consider the long-term impact on the European relationship with death. Before the plague, death was integrated into life. Cemeteries were in the center of town, and people would have picnics and conduct business among the graves. After the plague, death was pushed to the margins. It was professionalized, medicalized, and hidden away. The new cemeteries were outside the city walls. The care of the dying was moved from the family home to the hospital. Death became something to be feared and kept at a distance, a terrifying intruder rather than a familiar neighbor. This modern, sanitized view of death, our discomfort with its reality, has its roots in the overwhelming and traumatic experience of the Great Mortality. Let's talk about the idea of a scapegoat. The Black Death did not invent the practice of blaming a minority group for a society's problems, but it perfected it. The horrific persecution of the Jews was the most extreme example, but the pattern was repeated over and over. The need to find a simple, human explanation for a complex and terrifying problem is a powerful and dangerous instinct. The plague showed how quickly this instinct can turn into organized violence. It is a timeless and brutal lesson. When people are afraid, they look for someone to blame, and the weakest and most different among them are almost always the first to suffer. The sheer scale of the death toll forced a new kind of abstraction. People had to start thinking in terms of statistics. The bills of mortality, with their weekly lists of the dead, were a new way of seeing the city, not as a collection of individuals, but as a population, a set of numbers that could be tracked and managed. This was a cold and dehumanizing way of looking at the world, but it was also a necessary one for the authorities who were trying to control the crisis. This is another key feature of the modern world that was born from the plague: the use of data and statistics to understand and manage society, a powerful tool that always carries the risk of losing sight of the individual human beings behind the numbers. The Black Death was the first time that many Europeans became aware of themselves as living in a truly interconnected world. The disease had come from the farthest reaches of the known world, carried along the arteries of trade. It was a terrifying lesson in globalization. It showed that an event happening in a distant, unknown land could have devastating consequences at home. This new awareness was a source of great fear and xenophobia, but it was also the beginning of a more global consciousness. The world had suddenly become much larger and much more dangerous. The isolation that had protected Europe for centuries was over, for better and for worse. Let's consider the impact on art from a different perspective. The plague not only changed the subject matter of art, making it more focused on death and suffering, it also changed who paid for it. Before the plague, the greatest patron of the arts was the church. But in the post-plague world, the new class of wealthy merchants and bankers began to commission art on a massive scale. They wanted portraits of themselves and their families, paintings of their lavish homes, and grand religious scenes for their private chapels. This shift in patronage, from the church to the private citizen, is what fueled the artistic explosion of the Renaissance. The art became more personal, more secular, and more focused on the real world, a direct reflection of the values of its new, self-made patrons. The brutal truth about living through the Black Death is that it was a story without heroes. There was no great king who rallied his people, no brilliant doctor who found a cure, no saint whose prayers saved a city. The institutions that were supposed to provide leadership and salvation were revealed to be as helpless as the humblest peasant. The survivors were not the most pious or the most deserving. They were, for the most part, simply the luckiest. This randomness, this absence of a heroic narrative, is what makes the plague so profoundly unsettling. It is a story of human vulnerability, of the power of chance, and of the slow, painful, and leaderless process of rebuilding a world from the ground up. This lack of a clear hero or a simple moral is why the popular myths about the plague are so often wrong. We want to believe that in a crisis, communities come together, that people become their best selves. And while there were countless individual acts of courage and kindness, the overwhelming social reality of the Black Death was one of breakdown, of fear, and of profound self-interest. People abandoned their families, doctors fled their patients, priests abandoned their churches. This is an uncomfortable truth, but it is a crucial one. It reminds us that civilization is a thin veneer, and that the bonds of society are only as strong as the courage and compassion of the individuals who make it up. So when we look back at this distant and terrible time, what is the most important thing to remember? It is not the number of the dead, as staggering as it is. It is not the economic or the political changes, as profound as they were. It is the simple, human experience of living in a world that has been turned upside down. It is the fear of the unknown, the grief for the lost, the guilt of the survivor, and the quiet, stubborn resilience of those who manage to endure. It is a story that reminds us that history is not just a series of events. It is the accumulated experience of billions of individual lives, each one with its own hopes, fears, and sorrows. The Black Death serves as a permanent and humbling counterpoint to our modern sense of control. We have mapped the human genome, we have walked on the moon, and we can communicate with anyone on the planet in an instant. It is easy to feel that we have mastered the natural world. But the story of the plague reminds us that we are, and always will be, part of that natural world, subject to its laws and its indifferent power. It reminds us that an organism that is too small for us to see can bring the most powerful civilization on Earth to a complete standstill. It is a lesson in humility, written in the language of fever and despair. Let's consider one last time the sheer psychological weight of it all. Imagine living your entire life with the knowledge that this thing, this pestilence, existed. It was a boogeyman that was real. It could come back at any time, without warning, and kill you and everyone you loved. This was the mental background noise for every European for over 300 years. It shaped the way they raised their children, the way they did business, the way they prayed, and the way they dreamed. We cannot truly understand the art, the religion, or the politics of this period if we do not understand that it was all created by people who were living in the shadow of an apocalypse. The world we inhabit today was built on the foundations laid in the aftermath of the plague. Our ideas about public health, about the role of the state, about capitalism and the nation-state, about science and medicine, all have their distant roots in the desperate innovations of a society trying to rebuild itself after a catastrophic shock. We are, in a very real sense, the children of the Black Death. We have inherited the world that the survivors made, with its new possibilities and its lingering anxieties. Their story is not just a piece of history, it is our origin story. Ultimately, the journey through this period reveals a profound and uncomfortable truth about progress. It is often not a gentle, rational, or planned process. It is frequently violent, chaotic, and accidental. The Black Death was arguably the single greatest tragedy in European history, but it was also one of the most powerful engines of social, economic, and cultural change. It broke a world that was stagnant and, in doing so, created the space for a new one to grow. This is not to say that the plague was a good thing. It was a horror. But it is to say that history works in strange and often brutal ways. As we bring our journey to a close, let's leave the world of statistics and grand theories behind and return to that quiet, lonely feeling we started with. The brutal truth of the Black Death is that, for the individual who lived through it, it was a deeply personal and isolating experience. It was the silence of a house once filled with family. It was the fear of a neighbor's cough. It was the grief of burying your own child. It is in these quiet human moments that the true weight of the past can be felt. The pop culture idea of the Middle Ages is often one of chivalrous knights in grand castles. The reality, for most people, was far more precarious. The Black Death was the ultimate expression of that precarity. It was a reminder that life was fragile, that the institutions you trusted could fail you, and that, in the end, you were often terrifyingly alone. It stripped away the romanticism and left behind the hard, cold truth of what it meant to be human in a world without safety nets. So the romantic myth of communities heroically banding together is, for the most part, just that, a myth. The brutal truth is that society shattered, and from those shattered pieces, something new and arguably more modern was built. Not out of a grand design, but out of desperation and pure luck. It turns out that one of the most effective ways to get humanity to innovate, to reform its social structures, and to accidentally lay the groundwork for the Renaissance, is to have a third of the population die horribly. History, it seems, has a very dark sense of humor.